A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
It started innocently enough, the kind of exhaustion that wraps around your bones like a heavy blanket when you have a newborn. But by the time my daughter turned 3 months old, I found myself battling something far more sinister than sleep deprivation. It was the night I first heard the whisper, soft and slippery like a serpent slithering through my mind. I was alone in the nursery, rocking Sophie gently in my arms, her tiny body nestled against my chest when I heard it, barely above a whisper, "Tch, let me out." At first, I thought it must have been the moonlight playing tricks on me, a figment conjured by fatigue, but as the song on the baby monitor stuttered and switched to static, it repeated, "Let me out." Panic clawed at my chest, urging me to escape the nursery, but I couldn't leave my baby, not for anything. I forced a laugh, telling myself it was just the creaking of the old wooden beams. I made new excuses each night, the wind, the old neighbor's haunted house, anything to convince myself I wasn't unraveling. It persisted, creeping in at unexpected moments. I later realized I could hear it even when I wasn't in the nursery. Room after room, all while Sophie slept peacefully in her crib, as if oblivious to the dark presence spiraling around us. It became almost routine. I'd be washing dishes or folding laundry, the whisper would emerge, slithering through my thoughts, a ghost of sound coaxing me, "You have to do it." One evening, lulled by exhausted delirium, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, my voice trembling as I repeated the words out loud, "Let me out. Let me out." It was then that I caught sight of Sophie's reflection behind me, her innocent blue eyes wide and unblinking, gazing at me like I'd lost my mind. That night marked a turning point. Out of desperation to escape the eerie voice, I began yelling at Sophie, "Close your mouth. Don't lose it." So clueless to what I was doing. My frantic words seeped into the nursery's quiet as the whisper warped around them, draping the space in shadows, thick like fog. I remembered feeling guilty, but every time I opened my mouth, it was as if the darker side of me took control, and it didn't even want to stop at the yelling, it needed to dominate. "What do you want?" I shouted into the nursery one night, the air thick with tension as Sophie's gaze shifted toward the dark corner where the light barely reached. The whisper laughed, that soft, gravelly sound curling through the silence of the room. "You know what I want, dear. You just need to give in." I brushed off my fears by telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks, a stress-induced figment born from midnight feedings and a growing sense of helplessness I felt as a new parent. I sat down at Sophie's crib, looking at her sleeping face, and as if she sensed my panic, she stirred, a little whimper escaping her tiny mouth. I shushed her, and for a moment, everything felt okay again. That was until I was jolted from the reverie by the sound of my own voice murmuring, "You can keep it. Just don't let it go." The chilling realization coursed through me, I was saying things I couldn't remember even thinking. The next day, a desperate attempt to regain control led me to the local bookstore, where I buried my head in parenting books, seeking answers to the madness clawing away at my mind. I would hear parents talk about the stresses of newborn life, but as I desperately scanned the titles, my ears strained for the voice to cease. When I finally got home, I locked the bedroom door, hoping to drown it out with the blissful sounds of Sophie gurgling. But it wasn't enough, the darkness bled into every thought, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting, something that wanted to take Sophie from me. As weeks passed, I devised a new plan, no more letting her cry, no more leaving her alone in the room. I would constantly be vigilant like a guard. But the nights grew longer, and I felt tension creeping in around the edges of our lives like a slow poison, simmering until it erupted into anger and helplessness. I couldn't look my husband in the eye anymore, he could see the panic clawing at me and tried to reach out. I pulled away. "You don't understand." I screamed one night, tears streaming down my face, "You haven't heard it." My voice grew louder, spitting shards of my fear into the walls, but he only stepped back, bewildered, confused. I couldn't articulate it to him. Sometimes I thought Sophie felt the presence too, as I watched her stare into the dark corners of the room, her mouth opening like she was trying to speak with whatever lurked there. It felt like I was tumbling into madness, a dark tunnel with no end in sight. One night, I finally cracked under the pressure. I stood over her crib, screaming into the void, "Do not let it out. Close your mouth, Sophie." My heart raced as her sleepy eyes blinked up at me, the fragile innocence of her gaze slicing through the thick haze of despair. I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a moment where she understood, but then the whisper swelled, wrapping around us both, "She's mine, you know." In that moment, nothing else mattered. I swept Sophie from her crib, cradling her against my chest, desperate to shield her from the dark force that haunted me. I yelled at shadows, I yelled at the whispers, my voice rising in terror as I paced the dark house. That night, as I yelled and begged for it to leave us alone, the air grew cold, and the seals on my sanity began to crack. The last thing I remember is cradling Sophie close, her tiny mouth opening in a yawn, and for the first time, I realized it wasn't just me suffering, it was her too. The corners of my vision darkened, and I felt myself slipping away when that horrible whisper echoed in my head once more, "You've done well. Just a little more, and she will be mine." I released a desperate howl, my heart pounding, and then, silence. The next morning, I found myself in the living room, mysterious scratches running down my arms, and Sophie curled peacefully in her crib as if nothing had ever happened, her mouth shut tight. I looked into her eyes and felt something shift, it was gone. I don't know how long it had been, but perhaps, just perhaps, the battle wasn't over. And even now, each creak of the house at night makes my heart race. I can still hear the whisper sometimes, lurking around the corners of my mind, and I can't help but think the day will come when I'll have to face the darkness fully. All I can do is keep my daughter close and keep screaming the same words day in and day out, "Close your mouth. Don't let it out." I was a nursing aide at a small town hospital, where I quickly learned that the stress and fatigue of the job could turn even the sweetest nurse into a sourpuss. They would snap at patients, huff at each other, and treat us aides like we were invisible. It was around my second month when I devised a plan to even the score. I would make their drinks decaf when they were rude, my tiny act of rebellion tucked into the calm hum of the break room. At first, it felt harmless, even justified, like a petty thrill bubbling just below the surface as I watched their faces sour after a grueling shift. But then I started noticing strange things, shadows creeping in the corners of the break room, a heaviness in the air that seemed to settle with every snicker or snide comment I overheard from the nurses, not to mention the patients who never seemed quite right, always stealing glances at the empty chairs, mumbling under their breaths. It gnawed at me. And yet, I kept going, slyly swapping regular coffee with decaf whenever I caught a nurse berating one of my fellow aides or being particularly harsh to a vulnerable patient, not realizing that my little game started to draw attention. One night, as winter's chill seeped through the walls, my friend Lisa, who'd laughed it off when I told her about my scheme, said she felt foggy, like time was slipping through her fingers every time she went on a break. One more nurse added to the list of those who just seemed off. When Dr. Richards asked about her condition, all she could muster were mumbled apologies, her face pale like something from a ghost story. The nurses began circling the break room with suspicious eyes, one of them muttering about a string of odd occurrences in the hospital, missing equipment, patients who were unnaturally listless, and I could tell they were onto me. I felt like an unmarked pawn on a playboard covered in shadows. Then came that frigid Tuesday night when Angela, the head nurse, a woman known for her strict demeanor but also for the glimmer of kindness that surfaced on desperate nights, came to me snapping, demanding why I hadn't stocked the break room. Her voice had the bite of ice. I thought of revenge, how easy it would be to serve her the decaf serum of retribution, but instead, something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way her eyes darted to the right, almost as if she were searching for something I couldn't see, the flicker of candlelight casting jagged shadows against the wall. Something dark and twisted was emerging in the air, and I stood frozen as Lisa fainted, collapsing against the coffee station, her breath barely a whisper, mumbled words that sent a shiver racing down my spine, something about being too quiet. That night morphed into a haunting blur, whispers floated around the hospital, quiet but insistent, a spread of chaos shattering the carefully maintained calm as Angela turned to me, her clarity slipping, teeth bared in disbelief that hinted at innocence gone wrong. I served coffee to a nurse who told me that kindness was dying in the hospital, and I couldn't help but nod, the truth stinging like bitter coffee on a careless tongue. By the end of the week, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The nurses were losing grasp of reality, staring blankly into the void at night, eyes those of hollowed ghouls. It was no longer so innocent when Lisa warned me about the nurses who had been found alone, muttering to themselves, their faces pale against the stark quiet of their scrubs. They started showing up at odd hours, always whispering incoherent phrases, searching for something they could no longer understand in the sterile hallways. And the coffee? The bitterness seeped into the very fabric of our sanity. It felt suffocating, toxic, as if the caffeine I so maliciously deprived them of had unleashed a torrent of darkness. I was alone now, isolated in a hospital where every comforting sound had twisted into a haunting echo. My colleagues became specters, muttering their grievances like a spell gone wrong, and I was certain something sinister lingered in the corners, laughing at my naivety. The final straw came as I entered the break room, shaking like a leaf, expecting to see the usual dull faces of disgruntled nurses, but instead found Angela staring into the void, her mouth moving but no sound escaping, her eyes wide, reflecting back the madness she felt swelling inside. I took a step back, my chest tightening as her lips parted into what can only be described as a grin, and I realized in horror that she wasn't even aware of me standing right there. The memory of her voice, strong and commanding just days before, splintered in my mind, melded with words I couldn't comprehend. Was it a warning or a plea? I fled, my breath hitting in my throat, but the break room door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the grip of whatever force had consumed them. I ran down the hallway, the aroma of coffee clinging to my skin like a death sentence, feeling the pinprick of eyes following me through the haze. A wave of furious whispers crashed against the walls, each jagged syllable lacerating my thoughts, as I raced for the exit, desperate to escape the nightmare I'd created with nothing more than a cup of decaf. It wasn't supposed to be this way, I just wanted to teach them a lesson. But now that chaos feasted on kindness, and as those ivory walls closed in around me, I knew deep down I had underestimated the darkness, and it would never let me leave this hospital alive. I'm a nanny and I sleep on the job sometimes, hours at a time, which I know sounds dangerous and irresponsible, but let me explain how I got here. I started working for the Wilkins family 6 months ago, and at first, it was blissful. 2 sweet kids, Ellie and Jamie, ages 6 and 4, who were delightful in every way, always chattering and playing, with no signs of trouble until one night when their parents were out for an event and I found myself unusually tired after a long week of late nights and early mornings. Their sweet faces in the warm glow of the living room made it hard to resist the seductiveness of the couch, and before I knew it, I was out cold, snoring softly while dreaming of bright skies and laughter. I woke up to the sound of Ellie's giggle. Something jolted me from sleep like a shock, her little face illuminated by the soft glow of the nightlight, looking too closely at me, so close I could see the freckles on her nose standing out even in the darkness, and her innocent smile made me feel oddly unsettled, just a vague whisper of unease, but I attributed it to my exhaustion and focused on getting the kids ready for bed. Over the following weeks, I slipped into this dangerous habit, lulling myself into short naps whenever I could, each time with a shiver of guilt. But the allure of a few minutes of peace became irresistible, yet I kept waking to sounds that began to disturb my slumber, whispers that slithered under the door and brushed against my ears like a gentle caress, shadows creeping just beyond my line of sight, shapes that evoked an unshakable paranoia that clung to me, making me question whether I was alone in that house. One evening, after one more of those blissful yet dangerous naps, I was shaken from sleep again, but this time it was different. Jamie stood at the end of the hallway, his back to me, seemingly staring into the dark, murmuring something I couldn't quite catch, and my heart raced as I quietly approached him, only to be met by silence. He turned around, his expression empty, eyes glassy in the low light, and I had to remind myself this was the same boy who once laughed at bugs and played with friendly monsters in the nighttime. I asked lazily, "Jamie, what are you doing?" as I placed my hand on his shoulder, but he simply stared right through me, and a chill went down my spine, panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. So I shook him gently and whispered, "Jamie, honey, what are you looking at?" Suddenly his eyes flickered to life, wide with fear, and he whispered in a breathless tone that sent chills crawling up my spine, "Miss Chloe, it's standing right behind you." My pulse stalled as I turned slowly, dread pooling in the pit of my stomach, the air growing heavy as a cold presence wrapped around me like fog, but when I looked back, there was nothing there, just the empty wall. Yet when I turned to Jamie, his face was pale, his small lips trembling. All the warmth of that little boy vanished in an instant, and I knew I shouldn't dismiss his fear even if I wanted to brush it off as a wild child's imagination. I told myself to let it go, rallying my courage as we climbed into bed, but that night, sleep eluded me as I lay in the dark, listening for anything amiss when Ellie suddenly sat up in bed, her little voice breaking the silence as she called for me, her shadowy figure barely visible in the dim light, and as I rushed to her side, she claimed to have seen the lady in the corner, sending icy fingers of dread creeping down my spine as I tried to comfort her, struggling to fend off the encroaching shadows that felt more real than my fatigue, sensing I might be in over my head and questioning why I hadn't quit when new fears haunted the back of my mind, the notion that perhaps this place had a darkness I was unaware of, whispering secrets through the walls at night. Days passed, and the nightmares intensified. I began having dreams so vivid I couldn't tell them apart from reality, waking up to a silent house, the kids quietly huddled in bed, all because I had fallen asleep again, hours slipping by like grains of sand through my fingers. Rafts of anxiety clung to my every waking moment, but I drowned them out with mindless routines, chiding myself for my foolishness until I snapped awake one afternoon in their living room to an eerie stillness. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room when I realized I couldn't hear the children at all, the silence deafening and unnatural. I stumbled through the house, frantically calling their names, panic bubbling within me as my heart raced, the fear of a lost child piercing through my thoughts, and that's when I found them, not in the toy room or the kitchen, but outside, in the backyard, standing completely still, their backs turned towards me, facing the old oak tree at the edge of their property. I shouted their names, and they turned slowly, their blank expressions halting my breath as they said in unison, "We're waiting for her to come." My heart seized as I felt that cold presence wash over me again, a shiver racing down my spine, and in that moment, when I instinctively glanced towards the oak tree, I finally saw her, a figure cloaked in tattered shadows, standing motionless among the twisted branches, a dark smile stretching across her ashen face, and I stumbled back as fear took root inside me. I grabbed Jamie and Ellie, ushering them back inside, locking the door tight as I paced the house trying to convince myself it was all an elaborate trick of the mind until their parents returned home, and in an overwhelming rush of relief, I recounted everything that had happened, only to be met with blank stares and hushed murmurs, the mother swallowing her words and the father shaking his head, telling me it was just their imaginative young minds playing tricks, things like that couldn't exist. I felt dismissed but cautious nonetheless, filled with dread that I was losing my mind, and that night, as I laid in the children's room, exhaustion clawing at my eyelids, I decided just one more quick nap wouldn't hurt, sleep drifting over me once again. But this time when I awakened, I felt different. The room was cold, the air thick with a malevolent presence, and as I opened my eyes, the children were standing beside me, their faces blank, staring into the hollow dark with that same eerie calm, and there beside them, in the corner of the room, was the woman from the tree, her fingers stained like old ink, pointing straight at me with an unearthly smile. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, yet I couldn't move, couldn't scream, captivated, as I realized the children were starting to turn towards me, their voices a haunting melody, repeating the words I had heard so many times before, "You shouldn't have slept." In that moment, I realized the truth, perhaps the real nightmare had begun the moment I let my exhaustion lull me into a false sense of safety, and as the shadows enveloped us, I understood I was more than just an Annie in that house. I was a prisoner entwined in the horror of something far darker than mere tiredness, lost amidst the whispers of children long gone, forever caught in the chains of an eternal slumber, all while I lay there surrounded by the silence and the darkness. I always thought of myself as a meticulous person, perhaps a little too obsessed with presenting a flawless image to the world around me, and when I spotted the job listing for my dream company, with its sleek offices and promises of innovation, I couldn't resist the urge to embellish my resume just a little. Of course, it started innocently. I highlighted skills I had dabbled in, exaggerated figures from past jobs, and added a few awards I'd only dreamed of winning. Nothing that I felt merited a guilty conscience until the day came when I received the call that would change my life forever. "We'd like to offer you the position," the voice on the other end chirped, brimming with enthusiasm. A wave of euphoria washed over me. I could hardly believe my luck. My heart raced as I envisioned the trajectory of my career blossoming in ways I had only fantasized about. I quickly accepted the offer without a second thought, the thrill pushing any remaining trepidation about the deceit far from my mind. But as my start date approached, that exhilaration morphed into a persistent gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. On my first day, fresh and smiling while entirely unprepared for the wave of responsibility that hit me, my colleagues welcomed me with warmth, eager to show me around the sleek, high-tech workspace. Yet with every passing interaction, I felt the absurd weight of my lies pressing down on me, each laugh shared over coffee, and every confident nod in meetings chipping away at the fragile facade I had erected. Every task handed to me was a reminder of my inadequacies. I was scrambling to keep up with projects I had never been involved in before, ideas I'd faked familiarity with now swirling around me like ominous clouds. I could feel their gaze on me, an unspoken scrutiny as if they were assessing my every word and gesture for signs of deception. I brushed it off as paranoia until that fateful Tuesday when I walked into a meeting and was met with a shocked silence upon announcing my name. Suddenly, a hush fell over the room before a colleague I'd never met before leaned forward, eyes narrowing in recognition, causing my blood to run cold. "I didn't know they hired you," he said slowly, tension rising as he pulled up a screen and my stomach dropped at the sight of a dissected version of my resume in front of the whole team. It had been doctored, every impossible accomplishment laid bare, and I felt the walls of reality start to close in. In a brutal twist, he began listing my so-called achievements aloud, each lie unraveling around me as laughter morphed into whispers, Pointing fingers and surprised glances, their innocence shattered as they realized the extent of my deception. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears as I scrambled for a retort but found none that wouldn't further expose my incompetency. That's when I saw the reflection of something darting behind my colleagues, the flicker of movement so jarring that my instincts screamed for me to turn around. But when I did, the room was empty, a vast silence settled, an ethereal chill crawling up my spine. Only my colleagues remained, their focus now shifting to me, their glares less forgiving and more predatory. I mumbled something inadequate about needing to check my notes, my palms slick with sweat, and when I finally gathered the courage to excuse myself and escape the cold confines of that room, I felt highs pouring into my back, judging, mocking. I rushed to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, wondering how I could disappear, how I could undo everything right where I stood, but it was too late. The doubt gnawed at me, relentless and unforgiving. In the days that followed, it felt like I was being shadowed. Colleagues whispered as I walked by, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disgust. It was on the fifth day when I received an anonymous email that made my heart plummet. The title read, "You're in over your head," and inside, it detailed my lies piece by piece. I realized someone had been tracking me, watching my every move, ready to expose me completely, and the looming threat made me dizzy with anxiety. I had no idea who had sent it, but every response felt like a tiny noose tightening around my neck. The office's friendly smiles twisted into sinister grins. I imagined shadows following me from room to room, their whispers rising like smoke, suffocating me in a chilling silence. I wanted to scream out, to confess, to warn others of the twisted edge I teetered upon, but I was trapped in a web of my own making. One night, spiraling into despair, I decided to leave early, heart pounding as I slipped through the doors unnoticed, falling into the cold night air, desperate for some clarity. But over and over, day by day, my lies haunted me, twisting my thoughts like a sick roller coaster that gripped tighter with every turn. On my way home, I thought I saw someone following me, watching through the glass reflection of store windows, their face obscured, wrapped in shadow. I quickened my pace, each hurried footfall thumping against the pavement as my embarrassment morphed into palpable dread. When I reached my apartment, the door creaked open, and I let out a sigh, sinking against the wall, hoping it was all a figment of my imagination. But as I sunk into the comforting embrace of my couch, sleep refused to come, and the shadows of regret wrapped around me tightly. That night, I awoke to the buzz of my phone, an urgent notification flickering in the darkness. I hesitated, but something compelled me to look. It was an anonymous text reading, "We're coming for you," and I felt the world tilt, terror gnawing at my calm. I finally decided to confront my fate the next morning at the office, every nerve in my body screaming to go in prepared, to tell them the truth and accept whatever punishment awaited me. But as I walked through the doors, the atmosphere felt different. A thick tension, palpable and suffocating, settled in the air. There was an eeriness to my coworkers' faces, something beyond mere judgment, and I swallowed hard, hoping they wouldn't smell the anxiety rolling off of me. That's when I noticed the same colleague from the meeting, his expression oddly triumphant, as though he'd been waiting for me. Before I could gather my thoughts, he approached me with a disarming smile. "You think we didn't know? You think this was about your resume?" He laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills coursing through my veins. "The truth doesn't matter. We've been watching you, plastering yourself in a mask of lies for all the world to see. You're not the first, you know, and you certainly won't be the last." I stood frozen as he leaned in, his face inches from mine, a sinister glint in his eyes. "But you're special. We've got something for you." Panic bubbled under my skin. I was backed into a corner by people who knew things far more profound than I could imagine. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room darkened momentarily, unveiling shrouded figures lurking in the shadows behind my colleagues, fading into obscurity before my mind could fully grasp the horror. They approached slowly, their movements predatory, embodying everything buried under the weight of my regrets, everything I thought I could escape. "You'll find out soon enough," he whispered before stepping back into the encroaching darkness, and suddenly, it became crystal clear, this wasn't merely about my resume, it was about the very essence of lies, and how deeply they can penetrate the fabric of your life. As dread wove through me, I understood I was ensnared in a game far beyond my comprehension, and as a crooked grin spread across the room, I realized too late that there was no escaping the consequences of my deception. They knew. They always knew. I've always been the kind of person who believed in the power of money. After all, it was a currency of comfort that could erase the burdens of life, or so I thought, until I found myself standing at the altar, wedding vows trembling on my lips, with a man I barely knew, only here because of a contract that had my signature on it, a prenup and a promise of a lavish lifestyle in exchange for my heart. It started innocently enough. I was desperate to escape a dead-end job and an even more mundane existence, so when Thomas, an older, wealthy businessman, appeared in my life, I seized the opportunity, lured in by his charm and the glittering world he offered. From the outside, our engagement looked like a fantasy, endless parties, luxury cars, and designer dresses, but behind the veneer of happiness bubbled an unsettling darkness. Thomas had this way about him that sent chills down my spine, a cold stare that felt more like a predator sizing up his prey than a loving fiancé, and I brushed aside the red flags, convincing myself this was merely the price of my chosen lifestyle. Our wedding night was supposed to be magical, but it twisted into a nightmare as soon as the last guest left, the candlelight flickering in the oppressive silence of our opulent suite. That's when Thomas revealed his true nature, a mask slipping away to unfurl the malevolent person beneath, a tirade of contempt spilling out like poison as he berated me for not being perfect enough, making it clear that my role was to please him, to maintain his image, and from that moment, a dull ache sunk into the pit of my stomach, knowing I had traded my autonomy for wealth. Days melted into nights of forced smiles, empty laughter echoing through our grand halls while the walls closed in like a cage, where every slight misstep turned into a screaming match, where love was twisted into chains, binding me tighter with each passing moment. Yet on the outside, I perfected the act, becoming the doting wife to my friends, parading through life like a trophy on his arm while inside I crumbled, drowning in a sea of regret. One evening, after an argument that left me shaking and sobbing on the luxurious Persian rug, I stumbled upon his hidden office, a soft knock revealing a room stuffed with photographs and documents, each one unveiling a layer of deception that shook me to my core. There were pictures of women he'd married before, contracts botched by their desperation, of lives left shattered once their useful years expired, and with every snapshot, every name scrawled on legal papers, the reality of what I had become settled like a dark fog over my heart. It wasn't long before I realized he never intended to love me. I was a mere investment. I plotted my escape, late-night discussions with friends about going to the police, about my sanity screaming that this wasn't just a marriage but a prison. He'd groomed me for his next big sacrifice, and I needed to leave. The night I decided enough was enough felt electric. Fear and excitement danced within me as I packed a small bag under the cover of darkness, the faintest whispers of hope urging me towards freedom, taunting the palpable risk of being caught. But just as I was about to slip out, I heard it, the sharp sound of footsteps approaching, the hardened crackle of his voice slicing through the silence of the night, calling my name with a predatory hunger that made my skin crawl. Panic clutched at my throat as I scrambled back to our room, heart thundering, knowing he would never let me leave. I confronted him with a quiver in my voice, only for him to spin my words around, turning my desire for freedom into a calculated game of manipulation, reminding me what I was giving up: wealth, status, a life beyond imagination, a masterful facade of love wrapped in strings of my own making. In that moment, the illusion shattered like glass, and I realized my marriage was a trap designed to ensnare my soul, where every laugh was fueled by my fear, and every gesture a reminder of the life I had mistakenly chosen. So when he lunged at me in a fit of rage, I fell back, crashing into something cold and hard, his safe, the sound of metal clanging echoing through the dark, including the very riches I had once coveted. I knew then, without a doubt, that marrying for money was the worst mistake I could have made, and people said nothing could hurt me as we shared a life of billion-dollar yachts and mingled with the elite. I should have listened to the little voice deep inside my gut that screamed for escape. The next morning, I took action, not police. They wouldn't believe my attempts at freedom, but I did the only thing left that seemed possible. I collected the very evidence of his manipulation, his chains, and with a trembling heart traveled to the lawyer's office, securing a clandestine meeting away from the prying eyes of my gilded cage. My life was in limbo, in a battle that twisted my stomach with uncertainty, but the thought of endless wealth no longer felt tempting. Money became just papers that screamed a different kind of desperation. So, I walked away from that life forever, locking my crazy past behind me, as I entered a realm of the unknown where the shackles of false love crumbled away into dust, where I could finally breathe without the weight of someone else's greed suffocating my spirit. Days stretched into weeks as I rebuilt my life, piece by piece, discovering what it meant to be truly alive without a mask. Even as the regret lingered, cautioning my heart against the deception I had experienced, I swore to myself I would never be lured by wealth again. Yet, late at night, when the shadows danced just right, I could still feel the echo of his voice, reminding me how lucky I should consider myself, the taste of betrayal still bittersweet on my tongue, convincing me I deserved everything I had lost. my reality turned nightmare, taunting me with the possibility that maybe he was always watching, waiting to take back what he believed was his, and the thought clawed at the back of my mind, gnawing like a sinister specter, because marrying for money sucks, and let me tell you, I do not recommend it, not for anything in the world. I can hardly believe I'm finally writing this, but I need to get it out before it consumes me entirely. It happened last summer, a night that started like any other, with a few friends over and my parents away for the weekend, leaving me with the freedom that felt as intoxicating as the beer we'd snuck in. Among them was Sarah, a girl who had recently caught my eye, with her wild laughter that hung in the air like a sweet perfume, and as the night wore on and the music pulsed in the background, we found ourselves drifting toward each other, the kind of magnetic pull that felt thrilling and forbidden. As the clock ticked past midnight, the playful banter shifted to whispers, the air thickening with an unspoken tension, and it wasn't long before we were alone in my room, the soft glow of the fairy lights casting a warm halo around us as our lips met for the first time. I can still recall the rush of excitement coursing through me, the fluttering in my stomach like I was on a roller coaster, every nerve ending alive as our bodies pressed together. It was reckless and wonderful, the world outside fading into nothingness. Just as things began to escalate and I could almost lose myself entirely in that moment, the heavy creak of my bedroom door shattered the spell, my heart plummeting like a stone as I turned to see my father standing there, his expression frozen, eyes wide in shock as if he had stumbled upon a crime scene. Time slowed, wrapping me in a suffocating haze. I remember Sarah's face turning stark white, her eyes mirroring the sheer horror that coursed through me, and suddenly, shame clawed its way up my spine as I realized my dad was not just a witness but some plaque reading my son, a horrific mistake. There was no time to react, my voice caught in my throat, trapped between apologies and disbelief, and as I scrambled to pull away from Sarah, I felt the heat of shame wash over me as the incredulity of our discovery morphed into something far darker, a silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. My dad stood there, frozen but somehow retreating, slowly closing the door with a mechanical detachment that tore through me. I wanted to scream, to chase after him, to mend the invisible threads that had just snapped between us, but Sarah was wide-eyed in fear, and I couldn't even find the strength to face her. The moment shattered into a million jagged pieces, the laughter from the party outside now an alien sound, replaced by the chilling tendrils of a very real dread that wrapped around my throat. After that nightmare of an encounter, my dad avoided me like the plague, the looks he shot my way filled with a mix of confusion and disappointment that drilled deep into my chest, and the very air between us felt pregnant with unspoken words. Our interactions shrank into awkward nods and stilted conversations over family dinners, a growing chasm of unaddressed shame that left me spiraling into despair. I kept replaying that moment over and over, my mind torturing me by imagining what I could have said, how I could have justified the situation, how I could have begged for his understanding, yet, none of it mattered as the tension and silence grew thicker. I tried to distract myself with school and friends, but even those felt futile as I was plagued by an ever-present reminder of that night, and the laughter that once resonated with warmth within those same walls transformed into echoing ghosts that haunted me, taunting me with what I'd lost. It escalated to the point where I couldn't stand being home anymore. I found solace in wandering aimlessly, until one evening, while pacing the dimly lit streets, I received a text from Sarah, her words doused in melancholy as she expressed the helplessness we both felt. She wanted to meet, to talk about what happened, and I was both afraid and eager. It felt like a sacred connection we'd forged, spiraling further and further into darkness. We met at a quiet park, the shadows creeping like guilty thoughts around us. Her presence stirred up the feelings I tried so hard to suppress, yet the tension was palpable. As we sat side by side on that empty bench, grappling with the weight of the world on our shoulders, I could see the pain reflected in her eyes, mirroring my own. She told me she was sorry, that it felt wrong, but even in our shame, we both knew we were drawn to one another like moths to a flame. It's a cruel twist of fate, the very thing that should have forged a bond between us had now become a dark secret. A tender moment turned into a heart-wrenching silence that echoed from my father's discomfort and my self-inflicted guilt. As much as I wanted to talk about our feelings, I understood the unwelcoming shadow that hovered above us, ready to swallow us whole, and then, in a fit of reckless abandon, we kissed again, clinging to the remnants of innocence that still flickered within us. But just as quickly as it had ignited, fear snuffed it out. I broke away, stark realization flooding over me. My dad would never see me the same way again. We parted ways with a heavy heart, an ache lingering between us like the ghost of something that could have been. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would plunge me into an abyss. When I got home, I found my dad waiting for me in the kitchen, his face a mask of turmoil, An unshed tear glistened at the corner of his eye, a sight that shattered my resolve completely and filled me with an overwhelming sense of loss. Finally, it spilled out like vomit, my shame and fear, the inadequacy I felt. I was desperate to scream that it didn't mean anything, that it was just a mistake, but all I could manage was a choked whisper of "I'm sorry." My dad looked at me with a blend of pain and understanding, the silence growing thicker still until he spoke, his voice trembling as he revealed the weight he had been carrying too. "It's about trust," he said, and in that moment, I understood so much more than I wanted to. Bonds broken can never truly be mended. The realization sunk in, heavier than any spoken words, smothering me with its truth. This was my new reality, one where every glance would remind me of that one unknockable moment. The air hummed with tension, and I could see now that my journey into adulthood had shifted in ways I could never reclaim. My dad's eyes, once filled with warmth, were shuttered, a silent reminder that the innocence of our familial bond had been traded for a cold, impenetrable silence, leaving me with the bitter taste of regret and a hollow ache that could never fully mend. I can't stop looking at my ex's nude photos and videos, and it's driving me mad. I know I shouldn't, but every time I catch a glimpse of her smiling face from our past or those moments where the warmth of intimacy wrapped us in a cocoon of euphoria, my fingers naturally navigate to the folder on my phone that I promised I'd delete after we broke up, just a month ago. But I can't bring myself to part with them. My heart races as I scroll through those stolen moments, her beauty immortalized in a way that feels almost sinister, those perfect curves and soft, inviting expressions staring back at me from the screen, and no matter how many times I tell myself to stop, there's a nagging compulsion that pulls me back. Like an orbit around her sun I can't escape, and soon enough, I notice something strange, the angles of the photos shifting ever so slightly, as if they're morphing into a bizarre, twisted caricature of our time together, like the images beckoning me into a dream where I begin to question if my memories are real at all. I wonder if it was the loneliness that drove me there, the endless echoes of silence in our now empty apartment, or maybe it's guilt that paints everything with shadow, guilt for not appreciating her while we were together, guilt for the one stupid argument that made her walk away, and in that solitude, I lose track of days, letting the barrage of images and videos consume me. Time blurs as I replay those intimate moments, feeling not just nostalgia, but a strange melancholy washing over me, almost as if the love embodied in those pictures was taunting me with what I lost. One evening, after binge-watching my collection like it was an addictive series I couldn't wait to see the next episode of, I noticed something unsettling. A new video appeared in the folder, and I swear I hadn't recorded anything else. With new angles, her eyes seemed to glisten malevolently, and when I played it, my heart sank. She was speaking, softly at first, but there was an edge, a whisper that seemed to crawl beneath my skin, laced with sorrow that felt so real it made my chest tighten, saying my name, begging me to remember her the way she wanted, the genuine way, looping over and over again like some dark mantra. But then there was an unsettling punctuation in her voice, a shift, and suddenly the expression on her face turned sharp, twisted. "You can't leave me," came the statement, carrying an unsettling weight, a plea mixed with a threat that made my blood run cold. Panic surged through me as I shut off the phone and tried to clear my thoughts. "Breathe," I told myself, "this must be a prank or a result of my mind playing tricks on me," but still the pull to return to it was irresistible. That night I dreamed of her, of those photos, but they morphed into grotesque figures jarring and floating around an abyss, her face morphing into twisted reflections, mouth open in a silent scream, begging me through the void, and when I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling heavily in my stomach, gnawing at me like a parasite. Days passed, and my obsession worsened. I couldn't look at anything without the dark shadow of that video lurking in the back of my mind. It wasn't just the videos anymore, it was as if she had invaded my very being, and I could see her sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, walking away when I turned to look, leaving feelers of regret trailing behind her like smoke. Or worse, I'd sometimes hear her voice echoing in my brain, the words blending with sounds from my surroundings, and then the very worst thing happened. Late one night as I flicked coldly through the videos again, hoping to escape the madness, a new photo appeared, a close-up of her face, but this time her smile was wide and unsettling, eyes too dark to be human, looking straight at me through the screen as if she was inches from my reality, and I couldn't help but feel like she was hungry for attention, her smile like the final warning of a predator ready to strike. And then that familiar voice reached me again, low and dark, "You should have deleted them, you can't have me, you can't forget." I dropped the phone, the device crashing hard against the floor, but the image burned into my mind, and then the lights began to flicker. I felt the ground under me tremble as if it were resonating with her words, and that was it. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, Couldn't escape the thought of returning and just once more looking into those eyes, so tempting, so infinitely deeper than any memory could convey. Something in me knew it was wrong, that I should let go of the past, but a deeper part of myself, one that thrashed in darkness, held fast to the hope of reconnecting somehow. That maybe, just maybe, if I stared long enough, I could tame the savage whispers of guilt spiraling out of control. Hours turned into days, everything started to blend together, the laughter of friends grew dull and distant, the bright sunlight felt like a mockery, and as I sat alone in my dim room, staring at what started as a collection but had become a prison of flesh and pixels, I felt myself unraveling as her voice echoed higher, changing octaves, drowning me in something deeper than fear. It turned to rage. The thought of her rejecting me felt like fire coursing through my veins, and I blinked back tears, suddenly aware that I was losing myself in this labyrinth of regret fed by my fixation. Finally, when I thought I had nothing left, I made the final mistake. I hit the reply button on a message she had sent months ago, one saying how she missed us, how we could be friends again. I typed out a desperate plea, sending every feeling I had bottled up, longing for connection, for understanding, and hoped against hope she wouldn't see the madness that was entwined with it. Minutes felt like hours, and then the notification blinked, seen. I held my breath, and for an eternity, there was nothing, just a digital void until, finally, my phone buzzed, my mind raced, heart pounding as I opened the message, but it was just a blackout image with the caption, "You should have known better." I felt the world twist around me, the very fabric of reality unraveling, and in that instant, I realized I could never escape her, that this obsession was a shackle made of what I once loved, and as I glanced back toward my phone, the chaotic cycle of images and whispers consumed me entirely, leaving me no choice but to embrace the dark entity I helped create. I had traded my freedom for the intoxicating spiral of her hauntings, and as I was pulled down, deeper and deeper into that abyss where memories and nightmares fused, everything faded to black, leaving only her final smile etched in the hollow of my mind where I would forever relive the fracturing of all that I once held dear. I never thought it would come to this, but when I realized that my boyfriend, Tom, was drifting away, I panicked. It felt like the perfect storm of insecurity and desperation swirled around me until one night I snapped. My mind conjured up the most outrageous idea to win him back. I would fake a pregnancy. At first, I told myself it would be harmless, a temporary ruse, but the moment the lie slipped from my lips during an innocent dinner date filled with awkward silences, it became a wild, spiraling adventure that went far beyond my control. I texted my best friend, Sarah, who was supportive in a way only true friends could be, and she helped me come up with excuses, starting with late-night cravings and nausea that came out of nowhere, fleeting symptoms I'd finally decided were real. We crafted photo evidence of my baby bump and even shamelessly spoofed a sonogram image found online, texting it to Tom with a trembling heart. He was overjoyed, eyes gleaming in that way I hadn't seen in ages, excitedly planning out names and so immersed in his role as an expectant father that he never questioned my sudden loss of sanity, not even for a heartbeat. The deception spiraled out of control, leaving me entrapped in an elaborate web of lies. I had to maintain this pretense while juggling a job I loved, and in moments of solitude, I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in the mirror, judging myself for becoming a monster, but the love I felt for Tom pushed my moral compass to the corner of my mind where shadows thrived. When the day came for my first ultrasound, panic settled in as I could neither continue the charade nor reveal that I'd duped him. I crafted a story about how I was experiencing complications and had to reschedule the appointment, which only deepened his devotion and excited fantasies. But then I began to feel the anxiety clawing at the edges of my consciousness. What if he found out? What if this lie unraveled? The paranoia turned my life into a waking nightmare. Constantly touched with guilt, I developed a meticulous routine to avoid our mutual friends, lest they notice I was never really carrying a child. It was like being trapped in a real-life game of charades, but slowly, my fake pregnancy morphed from something I'd control into something that controlled me, as Tom began making preparations for a nursery, which sent me spiraling into crushing waves of guilt. I remember the moment he pulled out that sun-yellow paint swatch, his excitement bubbling over as he planned to transform the spare room, the mortification washing over me like ice water. I was ruining everything I once cherished, yet I couldn't stop. The more I faked, the more I couldn't escape the truth of my deception, until, one dark evening, I finally broke. The immense weight of my lies bore down fiercely, and I fell to the floor trembling in a mess of tears, clutching my phone tightly, ready at this moment to confess everything. However, my shame was compromised when Tom came in, laughing, a pack of baby clothes from his sister nestled under his arm. As he caught me off guard, and I fumbled, whispering something about feeling ill. It hadn't been that long of a deception, I thought, even as I recalled the months I'd already played this abominable game. And then it happened. Tom brushed my hair away from my forehead, eyes flickering with something that felt like pure love before he whispered those dreadful words. "Did you know pregnancy can bring on such weird symptoms, like pregnancy paranoia?" My breath caught. I couldn't form the words to respond, still lost in the web of deceit as my heart pounded dangerously in my chest. He waved a piece of paper in front of my face, and my stomach lurched. He had scheduled a baby shower with our friends, a baby shower, a festival of lies with laughter and kitchen tables lined with gifts meant to celebrate something that didn't exist. My entire world sparked in flames as that bloated idea danced back into my mind, setting off an even darker path. I thought I was pushed to my limits, but desperation has a way of breeding new lows, and the following day, instead of confessing, I concocted elaborate stories of testing that allowed me a temporary refuge to hide in the facade. That night my thoughts turned to terrible ideas about making my ruse more convincing. This could keep Tom, this could recapture his heart. I don't even know why, but I overdramatically collapsed while we drove to dinner, grabbing my stomach, claiming pain. The clenching of my gut was more real and visceral than any film's fake birthing scene, even as I gripped the seat with white knuckles. Panicked, we rushed to the emergency room, where the doctor's eyes narrowed as I muddled through my anguished screams and cries while a part of me recognized that I was crossing a line I would never recover from. Lying in that cold hospital bed under fluorescent lights, I could see how all this care for me would soon turn into rage if the truth were ever unveiled. And yet, in the midst of this hideous chaos, a strange thing happened. He held my hand throughout the worst of it, and a flicker of something like happiness ignited, one of those rare moments free from my profound guilt when I thought maybe being a mother was possible. But then came the nurse to check on me, and as she asked about previous pregnancies, I felt the ground beneath me shatter. I had never before felt so trapped, and I realized no lie is ever truly harmless, especially not this one, so deep it would drown us both. When the doctor returned with a surprised smile and ripped my sides with contradictions, "How do you feel about becoming a parent? And what did you think the baby's sex might be, sweetheart?" The crushing weight of the situation was upon me like never before. All of this had been orchestrated for a chance to dance on the edge of affection, but the darkness I'd conjured hung over my head like a guillotine. I wish I could relate a tale of redemption, where I escaped unscathed, but the truth can be sharper than any lie, and the only thing I remember was that moment when I held his hand, and it felt like reality. Then, when the truth broke free like a raven with a broken wing, the shadow of judgment was my only witness, because he was preparing to walk away forever, convinced I had manipulated him like marionette strings, and the room was falling apart, my shattered lies clattering in deafening silence. By the end of that night, I was left with more than just heartbreak. I was simply alone, grasping remnants of what felt like a fantasy spun into madness, the lie that had begun as a thread of hope unraveling to nothing, a terrible truth spiraling away only to find that deception can bind as tight as love ever could, but it feels heavier, much darker and ultimately fatal. I was 12 years old when my parents took me to Six Flags, a place that seemed like a kingdom of joy where laughter soared and screams mingled with the whir of roller coasters slicing through the sky, a paradise that turned into a nightmare that remains etched in my mind. The day started like any other. We rushed through crowds of excited families, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy swirling like a sugary fog. I remember my bright yellow t-shirt, its fabric slightly sticky with melting ice cream. I should have known the innocence of my childhood thrill would be robbed that day. We spent hours running from ride to ride, the adrenaline fueling our laughter, until I spotted the spiral of the Ferris wheel glistening in the sunlight. That wheel became my retreat, a slice of solitude amidst the chaos. There was a line, but my attention wandered to a corner of the park, a dimly lit arcade that seemed to call out to me with its flashing lights and the magnetic clinks of tokens. I excused myself from my parents and ventured inside, the noise of the park fading to a muffled hum. Inside, a group of older boys congregated near a racing game, their laughter echoing with something darker, something foreboding that made the hairs on my neck stand. They looked at me with a predatory gleam in their eyes, though I didn't understand the danger just yet. I played a game or two, reveling in the flickering pixelated glory, blissfully unaware as the shadows grew longer and the arcade grew warmer, like a heavy blanket I couldn't shake. That's when I felt a tug at my shirt, and there he was, a man in his late 20s, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low, his eyes hidden in shadow. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that chilled my spine, making me feel small in a way that made me subconsciously take a step back as he leaned into my space. "Hey there, kiddo, you want to join the fun?" I remember being too scared to respond, feeling a pulse of danger that cracked like static in the air. Somehow, I nodded, and he rewarded my compliance with a sinister grin. We stepped out of the arcade, the vibrant chaos of the amusement park feeling distant, obscured by the growing sense of unease that curled like smoke inside me. He led me to a secluded area behind a food stall, away from prying eyes and cheerful laughter that now seemed foreign. It felt wrong, but my youthful naivety blinded me to the gravity of the situation until it was too late. I can't recall the specifics, but I remember the overwhelming sense of panic as the world moved around me in slow motion. His grip was like iron, and I was powerless to break free. I managed to scream, but sound was swallowed by the cacophony of the festival behind us. I thought I'd die right there. It felt like a vacuum, sucking all the joy out of the world while leaving an echo of horror in its place as shadows danced mockingly around me. When I finally escaped, it felt like I emerged from a fog. I stumbled through the crowd, trying to find my family, desperately searching for safety amidst the cheerful, oblivious strangers. I don't remember how long I searched. Time twisted around me, stretching seconds into an eternity. By the time I found my parents at the log flume, I was drenched in sweat and trembling. I didn't tell them anything, the words lodged in my throat like sharp glass. Each time I tried to speak it felt like I was choking on the memories that refused to settle. I wanted to scream it, to tell them the monster I had encountered, but the shame of not being strong enough, of letting something so sinister touch my innocence sealed my lips. The rest of the day I forced myself to smile through the fear, to pretend that the world hadn't shattered around me, but every laughter wove a thread of paranoia, turning every face I saw into a potential threat. Finally, we left the park. The drive home felt eternal, the weight of the secret suffocating the air in the car. Night fell, and every shadow loomed larger, breathing darkness into my thoughts. Sleepless nights followed. I saw his face in the dark, twisted and grotesque, lurking just beyond my vision. I picked apart the memories like fragile wings, trying to make sense of my experience, fearing what I might uncover, while it tortured me that I hadn't told anyone, that I had let it happen. Each sound in the dead of night would send me scrambling for the bed covers, the shadows weaving tales of what could have been, what could still be. I tried to return to normalcy, but the innocence lost clung to me, a ghost that shadowed every interaction, scaring me away from new friendships for fear of betrayal and mistrust. Middle school became a labyrinth of paralyzing anxiety. Every corner held echoes of that day, whispers of laughter turned sinister, and I recoiled into myself, isolating until joy withered in the weight of dread. Years passed without resolution, but the trauma stained my psyche deeply, entwining itself into every aspect of life like a noxious vine. I didn't understand why something from that day haunted me until I stumbled across a thread online, stories shared among voices like mine, struggling to raise awareness against abuses hidden in plain sight. Reading accounts from others, I felt a flicker of courage spawn within. I began to connect the dots, engage and confront my painful past. Varying responses echoed back, some shared in empathy while others urged silence, and I still was torn, caught between wanting to cry out for justice and cowering in the shadows. At a therapy session, I finally confronted the fear that had clouded me for so long, revealing the haunting experience, the things that had robbed me of childhood joy. It was incredibly freeing yet so terrifying to release the fears trapped within as they tumbled out like marbles from a spilled bag. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of that experience was the realization that libel or rumors could tarnish my own name even through an eradicated past. As I learned to navigate the emotional minefield, I still face more questions than answers, like should I confront the fears of my past and reach out to that monster? Would he even remember me, or had I become just another lost child among his predatory roll of distant memories? The clock ticks on the possibility of recapturing innocence lost in that day, and while I work through the lasting effects, I have learned something crucial: shadows never stay buried in the dark, and though the past is a haunting specter, I refuse to let it control me. What I once caught in darkness is now bound in light, and perhaps, in time, my story can help others break free of their quiet demons and dare to illuminate the truth. It's been 20 years and I still can't stop loving her, but it's not the kind of love that fills your heart with warmth and joy. No, this is something tattered and twisted, a consuming force that claws at my soul. And it all began when I was just 17, that fateful autumn evening when Clara walked into my life like a specter rising from the fog. She had that old soul charm, a vintage dress that danced around her ankles, and wild curls that glinted like stars caught in her hair, and as we spent those late nights whispering secrets, our fingers grazing, I felt an electric connection, one that turned into a swift whirlwind romance, a summer of stolen kisses and laughter. But then came that fateful day when everything changed. Clara's laughter became fractured as her shadows deepened, and I learned too late that she'd been hiding something dark, a family curse that entwined with her blood. She would disappear for days, lost in the depths of her own mind, and each time she returned, there was less of her to hold, like sand slipping through my fingers, until I discovered she wasn't just running from herself, something was chasing her, something in the corners of our small towns and darkened alleys, something ancient that whispered her name on cold nights. I called it a curse, but later I realized I had underestimated its power. It wasn't merely supernatural, it was a living, breathing entity that wanted her, that hungered for her essence, and I was powerless to stop it. On that night, the night of the harvest moon, it all crescendoed. Clara had pulled away from me entirely, her eyes fogged with a darkness that made the world around her fade into the background, and despite my pleas, she vanished into the woods, chased by her demons, leaving only a will-o'-the-wisp glow behind. I followed desperately, my heart racing, adrenaline pumping, calling her name until my voice was hoarse, until I was knee-deep in mud and weeds, but the moon hung heavy and mocking above, and just as I thought I'd lost her forever, I found her in a clearing where the air crackled with a demonic energy, where shadows twisted into shapes of creatures I couldn't comprehend, all gathered like spectators, and Clara knelt on the forest floor, eyes wide, empty, and in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just losing Clara, she was transforming, surrounded by the darkness that had clawed and grown for her for so long. It was surreal, watching the love of my life become something else entirely, a halo of bitter light surrounding her, begging me to save her, but all I did was stand frozen, a frightful witness to the horror unfolding before me as she succumbed to the power drawing her, and when the echoes of her laughter turned into wails of anguish, I knew my heart was tearing apart. I reached for her, desperate to pull her back, but she was already slipping away, swallowed by a haze of shadows that drank from her essence, and with each cry, each shard of my soul ripped away, a voice resonated deep within me, whispering that this was it, this was the price of love bound in darkness. When the glowing ceased, the forest was silent, and all that remained was a chilling sense of emptiness, but even as I stumbled back home, paralyzed by grief, I never had a moment's doubt that she was still alive. I was certain she was somewhere, still fighting, still struggling against the chains forged from her very blood. As years turned into decades, I found myself captivated by the menacing specter of the past, replaying that night in my mind like a broken record, and though my heart became a twisted caricature of love, each year on the anniversary of her disappearance, I returned to the clearing, expecting to feel her presence, hoping for a sign, breathing in the air thick with desperation. I decorated the spot with wildflowers, lighting candles and whispering her name like a prayer, convinced the darkness that took her could somehow return her to me, but all I got in return were the echoes and memory, the stale warmth of memories tainted by her absence until one fateful night, after what felt like an eternity of longing, I was jolted from my reverie. It was late, and the fog rolled into the clearing thick and heavy, transforming the place into a damp, otherworldly realm, and as I set the candles ablaze, a chill seized me, the air quivering with a familiar heartbeat as if it knew I was there, and for a moment I was overwhelmed by the scent of her perfume, a reminder of nights wrapped in her embrace. Elation and dread battled within me as shadows danced at the edge of the clearing, and then there she was, ethereal and luminous, Clara, emerging from the mist, but she was not the girl I remembered, her smile was absent, her eyes lacked the warmth, and the shadowy energy flickered around her like flames, mesmerizing yet terrifying. "You were supposed to forget," she whispered, her voice like fragile glass, cutting through me, and every word was a stab in the heart as I felt the truth. I was not seeing the love of my life, I was gazing at a hollow stranger draped in her form, a futile figment of all that had vanished, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. My love had become a cruel reflection, and I reached for her, aching to pull her close, but as my fingers grazed her skin, a jolt surged through me, a searing touch that felt alien, and it struck me how much she had changed, how she was intertwined with the darkness now. "You shouldn't have come back," she breathed, and I could hear the sorrow in her voice woven with menace. But I didn't care, I loved her still, I would always love her. I never stopped, I managed to say, hope spilling from my lips, but before I could take another breath, the shadows surrounding her reached out like icy tendrils, wrapping themselves around my wrist as she took a step back, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. She was backing away into the depths of that darkness that had always claimed her, the gulf widening, and the air grew thick with despair until it felt almost solid. "I can't go back," she cried, and in that moment, I saw the real Clara glimmering through the cracks of that darkened shell. "You have to let me go," she urged, but the desperation clawed at my throat, each heartbeat louder and more frantic. "No. I can't. I won't," I shouted, the words spilling out of me like blood from an open wound, but she was already sliding further away, as if the shadows were pulling her back like tendrils from another world, and I realized, too late, that I couldn't save her. In that fraught moment, I learned love wasn't enough to conjure her back to life, nor would it ever be. Then, the shadows erupted, transforming into a storm of darkness, swallowing her entirely, and I was left standing alone in the clearing, breathless, trembling, crying out in anguish as the echoes finally fell to silence. The candles flickered one last time before snuffing out, and as I sunk to my knees, I finally understood. It had been 20 years of hell, missing her, yearning for her, but now the realization seeped into my bones that it was too late. Clara was gone forever, consumed by the darkness she had battled, while I was left with the heavy burden of this twisted, lingering love that would never release its grip, binding me endlessly to the pain of her absence, forcing me to survive in a world that felt dreadfully bleak without her light. I can still hear the creaking floorboards of my apartment, the way they groaned under the weight of the forgotten secrets that seemed to linger in every shadow. But that day was different. Despite the mid-afternoon light filtering through the blinds, casting striped patterns on the walls, I felt an unshakable heaviness in the air, a residue of dread that clung to me like static electricity. I'd invited my friend Jake over to share a meal, but my idea of a lunch date was about to spiral into something that would unravel not only our friendship but the very fabric of my sanity. I was attempting to impress him with my newfound obsession for health, whipping up a salad that looked more like a work of art than a meal, complete with organic arugula, heirloom tomatoes, and a drizzle of balsamic that I had learned to make myself. Not to mention, I had one of those fancy kitchen gadgets that spun leafy greens dry with the flourish of a magician. But as I chopped and mixed, a faint whisper of intuition nagged at the back of my mind, the nagging sense that I was being watched, an unshakable itch that made the hair on my arms stand on end, and while I brushed it off as paranoia, the feeling grew sharper the closer Jake's arrival approached. When he finally walked through the door, his easy smile momentarily soothed the prickle of anxiety that was gathering at my nape like the prelude to a storm. But the moment the door clicked shut, everything shifted. Jake's eyes darted around the living room, a shadow crossing his face, and for a split second, I saw something dark flicker in his gaze, accompanied by a strange tremor in his voice. As he complimented the salad, I felt a pang of unease as I noticed that neither of us could quite shake the feeling that we were no longer alone, an inhabitant lurking just beyond the periphery of our vision, an unsettled energy increasingly manifesting in the room, a heat pulsating beneath every ordinary surface, and yet I laughed off the anxiety like an unwanted house guest, convincing myself it was merely a figment of my overactive imagination. We sat down to eat, the vibrant colors of the salad contrasting sharply with the familiar surroundings, and as we dug into our bowls, the tension in the air morphed into something more palpable, saturating every bite, until Jake suddenly froze, eyes wide and unblinking, his fork hovering above his plate as he glanced toward the window. My heart began to race as he whispered, "Do you hear that?" That was when I realized the room had gone eerily silent, the mundane sounds of the outside world stifled as if sealed under glass, and just when I thought of dismissing it as nothing, I saw it, a figure in the reflection of the window, standing just out of reach on the fire escape, a long shadow stretching unnaturally against the bricks, and I instinctively but painfully squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was a trick of the light. But when I opened them again, nothing had changed except for the icy grip of fear tightening around my chest. Jake's breath quickened, and something flickered across his face. Was it recognition? But before I could process what was happening, the sound I had been dreading filled the air, a deep, guttural growl seeping through the walls as if my apartment itself was exhaling a long-held breath, and the light bulbs began to flicker, plunging us in and out of darkness as the figure continued to lurk outside, and as it stepped forward, I noticed what it was holding, a knife, glinting malevolently in the brief flashes of light. Jake turned to me, eyes wide with terror, and before I could speak, a cold realization sank in. He didn't just look frightened, he was terrified in a way that betrayed years of hidden knowledge, as if he recognized the threat with all too familiar terror. The color drained from his face as he pushed his chair back, making it screech against the floor like nails on a chalkboard, and in that dreadful moment, I understood, it wasn't just the figure beyond the window we should fear but something far worse. Jake's face twisted in horror, and he whispered, "Don't let it in," revealing that my seemingly innocent lunch had morphed into a battleground for survival. But just as I grasped the magnitude of our peril, my curiosity pushed me past the border of reason, compelling me toward the window, and that's when I began to feel a cold breeze, a whispering malevolence curling around me, and the moment I looked out, the figure flashed its blade toward me, its face veiled in darkness yet unmistakably human, with a smile that chilled my very soul, and in that instant, I felt the terrible weight of discovery. The figure wasn't an intruder at all, it was a reflection of everything I had ever tried to conceal, a version of myself I had buried out of shame, the darkness of my own mind given flesh and bone, and no amount of salad dressing could drown out the realization that I had laid out a feast for this very monstrosity. I never thought I'd find myself sitting in my car, engine idling, staring at the darkened windows of St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center, a place where broken souls go to piece themselves together. Yet little did I know that the ugly truth about what happened there was something I couldn't even confess to my therapist. It all started last fall when my best friend, Sarah, spiraled into a depression that echoed the classic signs of a life stripped of meaning. She would sit in her room for hours, ignoring calls and not replying to texts, which drove me into a frenzy of helplessness because I couldn't reach her through her walls of despair until one night, she finally broke down and admitted she needed help. She told me about her plans to check into St. Mary's, a supposedly prestigious facility known for its cutting-edge treatments and holistic healing approaches, and against my better judgment, I supported her choice, promising to visit as often as I could. What I didn't realize then was that St. Mary's was also a place wrapped in shadows, where the whispers of the past echoed through the narrow hallways and where the staff concealed secrets more insidious than anything the residents could possibly carry. Just the first few days of my visits there felt off. The nurses' eyes darted around nervously, almost as if they were counting seconds before a storm, while the patients, especially one named Oliver, who claimed to hear the voices of those who had passed, spoke in riddles that chilled me to the bone. My unease grew when Sarah admitted, on our third visit, that she'd begun participating in strange therapy sessions, something she referred to only as group meditations. I probed for details, and she mumbled something about finding the light, but her eyes were glassy and distant. I felt a knot of dread twist in my stomach as the days turned into weeks and Sarah's spirit dimmed. Each visit chipped away at her vigor, leaving her a hollow figure, nodding vacantly through conversations. I decided to dig deeper, researching online only to find vague references to the facility's controversial practices, whispers of experimental therapies that skirted the boundaries of ethics, but I dismissed it as paranoia until one night when I received a frantic call from Sarah, her voice laced with terror as she begged me to come and get her, insisting that the people there weren't who they claimed to be. I sped over, my heart racing, and arrived at St. Mary's just after nightfall, the cold glow of the moon illuminating the building's intimidating facade. When I burst through the doors, panic coursed through my veins. The receptionist was nowhere to be found, and the buzzing fluorescent lights flickered like the life in the patient's eyes, right before they went dark. I made my way through dimly lit halls lined with photos of smiling faces, a dreadful juxtaposition to the hollow-eyed figures they now housed, and when I stumbled upon the meditation room, I was seized by a primal instinct to flee. Inside sat Sarah, but she wasn't alone. 10 other patients, their heads bowed as they chanted in unison, a bizarre hymn that resonated in my bones, and the sight of Oliver, now at the center with a serene smile, made every hair on my body stand on end. I shouted Sarah's name, but she didn't respond. The group's chant intensified, almost drowning my voice out as the air thickened into something oppressive, not just a humidity but a sentience, heavy with an age-old malevolence that seeped into my lungs. I rushed forward, breaking through the circle, shaking Sarah by the shoulders, and when our eyes finally met, I gasped. What I saw was no longer the vibrant girl I knew but a lost, frightened reflection of a soul trapped in a web of darkness. All at once, Oliver turned toward me, his smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth far too sharp. "Join us," he intoned, and the others shifted, their faces contorting into grotesque mimicries of joy. I could feel it then, the pull of something sinister washing over me, like a dark tide threatening to consume everything I had known, everything I had believed in. I fought it back, dragging Sarah from her seat, but as I made my way toward the exit, I heard the whisper, the slow, cold voice of every patient echoing in perfect harmony, "You'll never leave." My heart pounded as I crashed through the door, the hallway stretching endlessly before us in a cruel trick of perspective, but as Sarah stumbled behind me, her screams pierced through the curtain of darkness, and my mind spiraled. I fought through the panic, urging her forward, adrenaline propelling my feet as if I could outpace the shadows that lingered just out of sight. We reached the stairwell and I shoved her through the door, praying it wouldn't latch behind us, but as we descended into the silence below, I could feel the air thicken, heavy with silhouettes that clawed at the edges of my vision, taunting me with their presence. At the bottom, though, was the tallest door I had ever seen, a massive wooden structure with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse and breathe, urging me to push it open. Somehow, it felt as though they were hiding something in there, something that connected the haunting hymns to the lives of the people trapped inside. With a quick glance at Sarah, I burst through, and what lay before me was something I could have never prepared for: rows of glass containers, each one housing a flickering shadow, faces twisting in agony. My throat tightened as realization dawned. The meditations weren't about finding the light, they were harnessing it, drawing the essence from patients to feed whatever dark entity lurked within their walls. I didn't have time to digest the horror before cold hands gripped my throat, dragging me backward as Oliver's laughter echoed, a cruel reminder of the fate that awaited us all. I fought like a wild thing, clawing at his grip, but the truth hit me harder than any hand. I would never be able to escape this place, not while Sarah was trapped too. I screamed for her to run as I succumbed to his grip, and in that moment, I finally understood what true despair felt like, being devoured by the very thing meant to heal. Months later, I tell my therapist how I was haunted by nightmares of Sarah whenever I shut my eyes, but I wouldn't confess the unbearable truth of St. Mary's, because I am sure it still stands, feeding off souls lured in by the promise of salvation, while somewhere, I hope Sarah is still fighting, somewhere in those shadows that even I cannot forgive. I never believed in the normal concept of good and evil. To me, they were just perceptions shaped by our experiences, until I stumbled onto a dark truth about myself that I should have ignored. It all began one mundane evening when I was scrolling through an online forum, where a group of people discussed how they had received prime access to something akin to an ethereal black market. They spoke of a subscription service where dreams could be bought and sold like commodities. I dismissed it as mere fantasy until, out of sheer curiosity and boredom, I joined. I felt an irresistible pull towards a listing titled The Life You Deserve, and the seller promised an existence where I could embody my deepest desires, no strings attached, just a simple transaction of your memories, beliefs, and reality. The moment I clicked accept and input my bank info, I felt the proverbial spark igniting inside me, a surge of something between excitement and trepidation. I was stepping into a pact I believed I could control. The night arrived when the deal was to be sealed, and as I fell into a restless sleep, I vaguely remembered hearing the seller's voice whisper through the void, "Welcome to the experience of your life." What followed was an otherworldly journey. I woke up the next day feeling better than I ever had, equipped with charm and charisma, and radiating a confidence I never thought possible. People flocked to me as if I were a magnet, promotions piled up, friends multiplied, and I seemed to be living a charmed existence. But lurking beneath the surface, the initial euphoria transformed into an insatiable hunger. I discovered that with each fleeting moment basked in success, I became addicted to this newfound power over my own narrative. As I savored the highs, I started to notice the threads of my old life unraveling, the messages from friends I barely had time for, the frantic calls from my family who snapped at my absence, and the mounting silence that filled the spaces where laughter used to echo. Ignoring the signals, I pressed on, diving deeper into this allure that had become all-consuming until one fateful evening when the facade began to crack. Alone in my apartment, I swiped through my phone, observing a world where everyone I once cared about had grown distant, their lives had moved on without me, while I remained perpetually glued to this narcissistic splendor. Then came the day of reckoning when I returned home late, exhausted from exerting every ounce of my new charisma. As I flipped on the light switch, I was hit with a sense of dread. My apartment, once filled with warmth, felt cold and uninviting, an empty shell. But that wasn't all, there was something else. My belongings had subtly changed, altered slightly to reflect aspects of me that didn't sit right. The dining table, once cluttered with old magazines and memories, was entirely bare, save for a picture frame holding a photo of me that looked almost alien, devoid of emotion, with hollow eyes that seemed to gaze right into my soul. Panic gripped me, and I quickly scoured the internet for the seller, feeling that I had been tricked, and desperately typed in "The Life You Deserve" only to find the page wiped clean, a digital ghost that left no trace behind. In that moment, a sense of clarity washed over me. I had achieved everything I had yearned for, but at what cost? I was haunted by the husks of connections I had discarded willingly in pursuit of hollow victories. I had become a specter, a mere shadow of my former self completely eclipsed by ambition. As days turned into weeks, I fought the growing void inside, engaging in desperate attempts to reconnect with my memories, but the harder I tried, the clearer it became that there was no going back. I could feel the pieces of my existence drifting further away from me like leaves caught on a merciless breeze. The profound loneliness morphed into panic. I couldn't function without the constant external validation. I found myself pacing the apartment, muttering to shadowed corners, desperate to recapture that warmth, when I noticed, quite suddenly, a figure standing beyond the sheer curtain of my window. I rushed to the glass, heart racing, but all I saw was the darkness of night, distorted silhouettes flickering in and out with the streetlights. I thought I'd lost my mind until I caught sight of a reflection looming behind me, a face I recognized but couldn't place, my own twisted image wearing my old self like a mask, deep lines carving despair around its eyes that shone with a sinister light. That's when I realized everything I had gained was merely temporary, a cheap substitute for the path I abandoned, leaving me stuck between but never wholly ensconced in either life. I felt the weight of regret like a blade buried deep within me. I had traded everything of value for glimmering illusions. It dawned on me that while I had grown from a shadowy introvert to a gilded socialite, I had forfeited the essence of what made me human, the messiness of relationships, the comfort of vulnerability, and the irreplaceable bonds of family and friends. Desperation clawed at my throat as I attempted to fabricate new memories that might heal the fractures, but the feel of genuine laughter, of shared moments, slipped further from my grasp. One night, under a moon obscured by clouds, the reality of everything imploded, and I sank to my knees in my bare living room as an audible crackling echoed, a sound not unlike the shattering of glass, and before I could comprehend what was happening, I was pulled into the dark expanse, a chasm of my own making. The whispers returned, haunting reminders that this was my reckoning. A shadowy vortex opened up before me, a sinister marketplace where voices melded into a chorus that echoed my name over and over, and amidst the frenzy surroundings, I saw it, the offering. My original life, nestled like a precious trinket amongst all things valuable I had redeemed, in exchange for my true self. It was a vision I had forgotten, filled with laughter, warmth, and vibrant connections that once painted my world in brilliant colors. But the catch was clear: reclaiming that life meant I would forfeit my newfound power, becoming an ordinary ghost of my former self, a choice I was loath to make. In that moment of indecision, I felt time bending, collapsing, everything I had achieved swirling around me in an inescapable storm of consequence, leading me face to face with my past. I knew I should have walked away, I should have resisted the allure of what I was never meant to possess because ultimately, that world was ephemeral, leaving me hollow and lost. In a desperate bid to reclaim what I had left behind, I reached out, grasping for a thread woven into the tapestry of my existence, the warmth of my family, the laughter of friends, the little moments of failure that once shaped me. As my fingers brushed against the vision, everything came crashing down, and I awoke the next morning back in my old life, pocked with scars but remarkably intact. Yet, even as dawn broke, I couldn't shake the feeling. My world had fallen apart because of my insatiable hunger, revealing a truth darker than I ever imagined. I had chosen to run towards something I thought I wanted, unaware that sometimes, what you really seek is buried deep within the life you already possess. When I found out I was pregnant, it was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life, a dream realized after years of struggling with infertility and the heartbreak of miscarriages, but the joy was short-lived, overshadowed by a crushing sense of betrayal that gnawed at my insides like a ravenous beast. My partner, Jake, the father of my child, had always been charming and affectionate but had taken to acting distant and secretive over the last few weeks, something I brushed off as stress until one late night. My curiosity turned into dread as I found his phone left unattended on the kitchen counter, the screen illuminated to reveal a conversation with another woman that felt like a slap across my face. My pulse quickened as I read their flirtations, peppered with promises and innuendos that made my stomach twist, the last message searing into my memory: "Can't wait to feel you again, even if she's carrying your baby." I launched into a fit of rage and despair, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I confronted Jake, demanding the truth, and the moment he stumbled over his words, shame and guilt pooling in his eyes, I knew he had crossed a line, and as he confessed to his infidelity, the world around me shattered. He was unrepentant, claiming it was a mistake, that the affair had been meaningless, and when I finally got his admission that he hadn't used protection, my breath hitched, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. But the real horror didn't hit me until a few weeks later when I started to feel unwell, just a few cold sweats and brief moments of nausea at first, the kind of symptoms that are all too common during pregnancy. But then came the burning sensation and the dark realization that accompanied it: I had an STD, or at least that's what I pieced together from bits of information on the internet during those frantic, bleary-eyed nights. The diagnosis from the clinic was brief and sterile, but the words chlamydia and potential harm danced before my eyes, the nurse's voice a distant echo, as I sat frozen in the waiting room, tears spilling down my cheeks as I imagined the tiny life inside me being twisted and affected by Jake's betrayal. All I could think about was how I had wanted this baby so fiercely and had already lost so much, terrified that my body's failure to fight against the infection might take everything away from me again. When I returned home, the air felt heavier, thick with the unspoken truth that lingered between us like a festering wound. I could barely look at him, and I didn't want him to touch me, to comfort me, to pretend that everything was fine when I felt like I was spiraling into a dark abyss of despair. I should have left right then, packed my things, and just gone, but I was pregnant, scared, and too attached to the man I once loved to just walk out. I could still hear his voice, hear him say he had made a mistake, hear the hollow promises he offered to make it better, and I was weak enough to believe him, at least for a little while, until everything changed yet again. One evening, I felt the needling pain in my abdomen and decided I had to go to the emergency room. The doctors performed tests and determined my body was fighting against not just the STD but an infection that had taken root within me. But as the hours stretched on and I lay in a sterile hospital bed, the world outside became distant, a blur of voices and machinery, my focus narrowing to the steady rhythm of the monitor tracking the life growing within me, until it was interrupted by a blaring alarm that sent panic coursing through my veins. Doctors rushed into my room, and amidst their hurried conversations, I could hear snippets of phrases about peril and emergency C-section, and everything went black. When I woke, the bright lights of the recovery room pierced through my eyelids, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of my choices drop heavily on my chest. My heart raced as I glanced around, desperately seeking confirmation that my baby was safe, that I hadn't lost the one thing I cherished the most. But instead, a nurse with a sympathetic glimmer in her eyes approached, her words gently telling me that my baby had struggled but was stable now, a mixture of relief and fear washing over me. But part of me felt hollow, knowing that this fragile existence was a product of deceit and betrayal, a tainted legacy growing silently because of Jake's choices. I demanded to speak to the doctors, and when they described the potential consequences of the infection, how the untreated chlamydia could lead to long-term effects on my baby's development, it felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I felt like a failure as a mother already, and I hadn't even given birth yet, the guilt ripping through me as I vented my anger at those who had wronged me. I returned home after days of monitoring, my heart still heavy with fear and anger. Jake was waiting for me, remorse plastered on his face, but all I could think of was every touch that felt tainted by his infidelity, every promise he made laced with dishonesty. I wanted to hate him, wanted to let my rage bubble over into something more tangible, but I found myself stuck in this morass of emotions, just trying to keep myself together for the baby's sake. Months passed, and I slowly learned to forgive myself for what had happened, as if it would alleviate some of the guilt I wore like a second skin. But the day I delivered my daughter felt like releasing a secret I had held too long. The labor was excruciating, but as I held her in my arms for the first time, the pain dissipated like a long-lost memory. Yet even then, a cruel twist remained, a gnawing thought that returned alongside the love I felt, that my daughter would always carry the shadow of her father's betrayal, and as I sat cradling her, I realized I not only bore the emotional scars of Jake's betrayal but also the remnants of his callous actions, leaving me to wonder if every small hiccup she had would be another reminder of the darkness he had brought into our lives, each milestone a grim reflection of the love I had fought for against impossible odds. In the years that followed, I watched my daughter grow, wincing at every cough, every fever, hoping I wouldn't see the repercussions of my trust in her father manifest in her health, my heart thrumming with anxiety as I meticulously monitored her development, feeling as if I was living in the shadow of an impending storm. The day she took her first steps, my heart swelled with pride, but a dark cloud loomed as I recalled the intentions that had led to her conception. I made a decision then, I would never let Jake lay his eyes on her, our once perfect life shattered beyond repair. I planned to be the mother she deserved, one who could shield her from the pain of betrayal that crept, silent and ready, from the very man who was supposed to protect us both, resigning myself to the reality that some scars never truly heal, that every moment with her was a chance to rewrite our story, even if his shadow would always linger just beyond the periphery of our lives. I never thought a simple doodle could turn my life upside down, but it all started that fateful Tuesday when the deadline for my marketing project loomed large and the stress made me feel like I was about to burst. It was a typical day at the office, the hum of fluorescent lights melding with the occasional clatter of keyboards, and I was desperately trying to seek a moment of relief from the pressure when I resorted to doodling on the back of a scrap sheet. Just mindless sketches at first, but I found my hand taking a mind of its own, the ink flowing freely until a crude image of a woman began to emerge, her voluptuous curves exaggerated to the point of absurdity, and before I knew it, I had created something that certainly crossed the line of professionalism. It was supposed to be a throwaway, an escape from the mundane, but somehow in my delirium, I thought it might be a hilarious prank to leave it in the bathroom for my co-workers to find. So, with a chuckle and a misplaced sense of bravado, I left the sketch taped near the mirror, knowing my colleagues would be amused, perhaps shocked, but definitely entertained. The toilet blobbed behind me as I walked back to my desk, a thrilling but irresponsible sense of rebellion flooding my veins. The day trudged on, filled with meetings and pressure, but then, as the clock struck 4, I heard an explosion of laughter from the bathroom. I felt a rush of vindication. It was a hit. But as I wrapped up my workday and headed home, my mind buzzing with excitement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The laughter felt wrong, ringing with a twisted edge, almost manic, echoing like it was too loud for just a few people. When I arrived home, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages from my coworkers flooded my screen, filled with emojis and jokes referencing the doodle. In one instant, I felt like a hero and a villain, but as the hours passed, I noticed something unsettling, a particular text from Dave, our office's mild-mannered IT guy. "You think this is funny? You better watch your back." I laughed it off, convincing myself that it was all in good fun, but deep down, the laughter from earlier replayed in my head, mulling over the twisted undertones that chilled me. That night, I dreamt of the doodle. It warped and morphed, the figure contorting in ways that made my skin crawl, and when I jolted awake at 3 a.m., soaked in a cold sweat, all I could feel was dread gnawing at my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling that the laughter hadn't been innocent, there was something sinister lurking behind it. I chalked it up to stress and decided to apologize to my team the next day, a simple acknowledgement of my poor judgment. However, as I walked into the office, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The usual banter was replaced by hushed whispers, glances thrown in my direction that melted into uncomfortable silence as I approached my desk. Dave was waiting for me, unusually calm with an unsettling grin plastered across his face, and every ounce of my previous bravado melted into cold fear. "You really think you're funny, don't you?" he said softly, but the words dripped with a venomous edge. I attempted to downplay the incident, but he lunged forward, placing a finger on my shoulder with a grip that felt like ice. "You've awakened something, don't you understand? That doodle, it wasn't just a joke, it was an invitation." His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, my laughter felt like a distant memory. The panicked feeling rose again, the kind that tells you something has gone horribly awry. A gnawing uncertainty fed by fragments of laughter echoed in my mind as I made my way to the bathroom, heart racing. When I swung the door open, I was met with an eerie silence, thick and oppressive. The mirror reflected the paper, now besmirched with something dark, blotches that appeared to grow like a virus, twisting and shifting the joyful cartoon into something grotesque. My heart sank as I recalled a fleeting thought, a split second of realization that what I drew had taken on a life of its own when the walls of laughter disappeared. My phone buzzed with another text from Dave, "You shouldn't have left it there." My blood ran cold, the laughter was now replaced with an airy ambience that felt like a predator breathing down my neck. I bolted from the bathroom and gathered my things, determination flooding my veins to get the hell out of there, but as I made my way to the exit, I was met with a blockade of coworkers, faces twisted in glee, eyes vacant, they weren't themselves anymore. Then I noticed a figure in the back, dark and looming, shrouded in shadows, where the light seemed to shut away. It grinned in a grotesque parody of laughter, a visage that echoed the thing I had drawn, long limbs sprawled and a wide mouth that split too far too wide, and as it stepped into the light, I saw the blend of my doodle and something grotesquely real. It was then I realized, horror seeping into my core, that they weren't just laughing at me, they were all a part of it now. Puppets danced to a tune I had unwittingly composed, and the line between my nightmare and reality had blurred. I dashed for the exit, my heart pounding in tandem with the ultimate realization. I had opened the door to madness, and no one, especially not my own hands, would keep the darkness at bay. I escaped into the murky embrace of night, never looking back until now, each sleepless night feeding into the whispers of my former co-workers, and though I've tried my best to just forget, every corner I turn flickers with memories of laughter, and that suffocating shadow that stretches ever closer, hungry for a new doodle, a new invitation to join its sinister party. I'm not proud of it, but I suppose that I can blame the vodka for what happened that night, though part of me wonders if I was just asking for trouble, inviting chaos into my life the way so many of us do when intimacy blurs into drunken revelry. It was supposed to be a fun night at Barry's, one of those parties designed for just enough alcohol, one more shot to let loose, maybe find a partner who was equally as lost in the haze of easy laughter and wild desires. I got chatting with Lisa, who I always thought was jaw-droppingly beautiful, her long dark hair cascading down her shoulders like an endless waterfall, and when she smiled, it lit something inside me ablaze. We ended up in his cramped little bedroom, fumbling with each other's clothes and kissing passionately, me feeling a rush of adrenaline as her nails grazed my back. It all seemed like the perfect chemistry, warm bodies in the dark, generating heat with every breath. But then, just as we were making our way under the sheets, the mood shifted, the atmosphere flooded with an electrifying, unnerving energy. I couldn't quite place it at first. It felt like an intense, suffocating weight that made my skin go cold despite the stifling warmth surrounding us. I felt dizzy, the vodka hitting me harder, and I needed to focus. I leaned back, about to whisper something sweet to Lisa when I noticed a shadow in the corner of the room, moving unnaturally against the wall. My heart raced. I told myself it was just the flickering light from the old ceiling lamp, but as I squinted, the shadow didn't budge, didn't flicker. My breath quickened when I recognized that it wasn't just a trick of the light. A figure was sitting in the corner, obscured, watching us. I could barely make out a silhouette, long and spindly, too long to be human, and my stomach churned, a rational side of my mind screaming for me to ignore it, to come back to the warmth of Lisa's touch. I tried to pull her closer, to shrug off the fear, but every ounce of strength to ignore the dark presence evaporated when the figure leaned forward, a sound like cracking bones slicing through the thick air, and in a swift, inhuman movement, it lunged towards my side of the bed. Lisa screamed so loudly, it felt like glass shattering around us, and I felt paralyzed, unable to process anything beyond the intense dread that swept over me. The figure stopped inches from my face, grotesquely inhuman, a hollow eye socket scanning the room like it wanted to devour the shadows. That was when I knew this was not a feeling of drunken paranoia, it was something real, and in my gut, the unmistakable sensation of danger screamed at me to run. I turned to grab Lisa's hand, to pull her away, but she was frozen, staring into the figure's emptiness, and I screamed, "We have to go. Now!" It took a few brutal seconds to drag her from the bed, and when we stumbled towards the door, the dark presence melted into the light, blocking our escape. In that moment, the alcohol and ecstasy of the night evaporated, replaced with sheer terror. I was scared stiff, every hair on my body standing on end as the figure opened its mouth wide, revealing jagged, chipped teeth that looked like they could tear flesh with a single bite. I don't even know what possessed me to grab Lisa and push against the closed door, but somehow, I broke through the grip of horror that had entrapped us both. We slammed through the door, fleeing out into the living room filled with drunken partygoers, who were obliviously laughing, but the second we stepped into that light, the shadowy figure melted back into the corner, vanishing like a nightmare. I pulled Lisa away, my heart hammering in my chest, and we found a corner away from the chaos, her wide eyes full of confusion and dread. "Did you see that?" I asked, breathless, but she looked right through me, her face pale, her lips quivering. "What are you talking about?" But the chill that settled into my bones told me it didn't matter if she believed me or not, that thing had followed us, had marked our encounter, and just moments before, I was sure we were both alive, but now? Now I felt the deepening dread, that something terrible lurked beneath the laughter, watching, always watching. The night continued to unravel around me, Barry's party carried on, oblivious to the horror that had taken place in that bedroom, and yet the laughter felt all wrong, jarring, like a mockery of something beautiful turned grotesque. I could feel the dark aura of that figure lurking just behind my shoulder, waiting for the perfect moment to take its hand and draw me back into darkness. I grabbed Lisa's shoulder, both of us feeling the brush of icy danger that made the air thin as if we were surrounded by an invisible force. Every time I thought about going back in for my jacket, I felt the evening air prick my skin with sharp reminders of what we had done. It felt like a mistake, like that simple act of getting freaky had summoned something worse, something that might never leave us. Days turned into nights, and every moment, the shadow waited, whispering my name at the terrible hours of the night when I thought I was safe in my bed, sending shimmering chills throughout my body. I watched as my once joyous world unraveled. The vodka couldn't drown out my thoughts, the laughter of friends became hollow echoes, and every flicker of a shadow made me hyper-aware of the danger that crept closer. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that gaping maw, those empty sockets piercing straight through me as if it consumed my very essence, and every single night, I kept searching for that reminder of my mortality lost in the fantasy of lust, horrified by what I had unleashed. When I finally came to terms with the haunting reality of what we had brought into this world, I knew that something had shifted within me, and I would never be able to go back to the blissful ignorance I once took for granted. I learned too late that sometimes, when we try to get freaky, we invite some truly terrifying things home with us, and those things, once invited, seldom leave without claiming a piece of us first. It was a meaningless night, just a threadbare Tuesday in a city that was all glaring lights and shallow smiles, the kind where loneliness could wrap around you tighter than a warm blanket, suffocating in its comfort, and I was drinking alone at a bar when it hit me. I'd been invisible for way too long. With every passing glance from strangers fading into the vinyl of the booth behind me, it felt like I'd become a mere phantom, hovering on the outskirts of their lives, and in a moment of reckless abandon, I muttered to myself that I might sleep with the first guy who says I'm pretty, a joke, a desperate plea, or maybe an ill-conceived promise to change my own narrative. The bartender shot me a sideways glance, amusement flickering in his eyes as he poured another drink, but then, out of the blue, a figure stepped into my periphery, someone who had the audacity to make my heart race in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying, an unkempt blonde with exaggerated confidence, his gaze settling on me like a moth seeking warmth from flame. He leaned against the bar, his grin cocky, yet something in his expression was unsettling, as if he could smell the darkness lurking beneath my skin, and just as I considered sliding down the bar to safety, he leaned closer and grinned wider, his voice smooth as silk. "You're pretty," he said, words draping over my senses like a warm blanket, igniting something in me that screamed to be set free. I barely felt the flush creeping into my cheeks, that desperate need for validation turning treacherous, and the world around us blurred into insignificance as all the barriers I'd built teetered on the brink of collapse, the odd familiarity of his gaze shattering that carefully constructed wall, and just like that, the playful dare I'd thrown into the dark now sat weighty and solemn in the air between us, charging the moment with an unforeseen kind of gravity, and before I could think better of it, before that voice in my head could guide me back toward reason, I found myself nodding, inching closer, my heart hammering in my chest like a war drum. The night spiraled into chaos, we slipped out into the neon-streaked streets, the city humming with a life that felt foreign after my self-imposed exile, and a flicker of worry flashed through my mind, but it was drowned out by the intoxicating thrill of it all, this strange chemistry overwhelming and bizarre, the risk dancing at the edge of every moment. I didn't know him, didn't even know his name, yet we laughed as we wandered past the bars and clubs, our banter laced with layers I barely understood, and just like that, we ended up in a dark corner of the alley behind a forgotten diner, the air thick with smoke and whispers of secrets, where his lips found mine with urgency, something desperate and primal igniting between us. I was lost in his kiss, tasting rebellion and freedom as his hands roamed my body, and as the moment stretched into eternity, I felt myself surrendering, the forgotten parts of myself awakening. Yet amidst the passion, a small voice in my head whispered a warning. There was something off, a frisson of danger curling around us like a wisp of fog, but I pushed it down, shoving it into the corners of my mind as he pulled me closer, almost possessively, and that's when I noticed the change, the way his eyes darkened, losing the spark of mischief, morphing into something predatory, and I felt a chill creep down my spine as panic threaded in, the world drifting out of focus just when clarity should have struck, and suddenly, as if the shadows themselves had fingers, he gripped my wrist tighter, a little too tight, and I could feel the pulse of my heart clawing its way up my throat as reality came rushing back. "Why won't you let me in?" he growled, something unspeakable lurking in the depths of that gleam in his eye, and I could suddenly see past his charm, the mask slipping to reveal a visage bruised by the darkness festering behind it. Laughter that had seemed so careless now felt hollow, like the night itself had conspired to deceive me, and just as the air thickened with uncertainty and fear, I stumbled back, breaking the spell, realizing that I had underestimated the weight of my words, the potential darkness lurking behind the simple acknowledgement of prettiness. My voice quivered as I tried to conjure an excuse, a path to safety, regret surging through me, trailing hot and furious as instincts kicked in, but he held me in place with that relentless grip, eyes boring into mine like he could see everything, the cracks and scars I'd tried to hide, his gaze pinning me down as if I were prey, and I was paralyzed, caged in that fleeting mistake, in the silent screams of my own mind begging me to break free. Shaking, I thought again of every moment I'd spent invisible, of every time I'd doubted myself, of how little I'd believed in my own worth until now, and that realization clashed with the panic washing over me, now a looming threat bleeding through my veins as I fought for breath, trying to maintain a fragile grip on my reality. Just as I was about to scream, the night itself ruptured, a couple stumbled into the alley, laughter spilling in laughter and chaos, and in that brief distraction, I broke away, surging past him back toward the pulsating base of the party. But the echo of his voice, chilling and insistent, haunted me even as the noise of life surrounded me with warmth, and somewhere in the swirling shadows of that night, I could still feel his gaze lingering, a promise of danger that now felt like an infestation, clawing at my skin, whispering that the lines between pretty and perilous had blurred in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. As I finally settled back into my seat, attempting to drown the panic with another drink, I couldn't help but think about the folly of that initial dare. I might have wanted to embrace every last thrill, every fleeting validation, but what I had brushed against tasted much more like a curse, a warning that maybe the city would swallow me whole, wrapped in a sleek glamour laced with doom, And as I stared into the glass filled with ice and alcohol, I understood something deeply unsettling. Sometimes the first words that slip between strangers can lead you straight into darkness, and the scars of those choices can cut deeper than you might ever know. I must admit that I've spent years contemplating whether to share this story, an experience from my childhood that haunts me even to this day, a dark secret I buried deep beneath layers of innocent laughter and carefree play, but now it claws its way back up, and I fear I won't be able to rest until I've confided it to the world. It all began when I was 6 years old, a time when the fabric of reality felt more like a canvas to be painted on than a set of hard and fast rules, and I desperately wanted to fit in with the other kids who would often gleefully chatter about their sleepovers, filled with whispers, snacks, and stories that stretched late into the night. So, one day, after filling my mind with visions of pillow forts illuminated by the soft glow of fairy lights, I concocted a small lie to convince my parents that my best friend Lily was having a sleepover and begged them to let me go. That fateful night in early October was thick with the bite of impending winter, but I felt warm and giddy with the anticipation of a night spent immersed in make-believe with my closest confidant, immersed in a world far removed from the mundane life of my suburban existence. So I practically skipped down the street to her house, clutching a hastily packed backpack filled with every plush toy I deemed crucial for safety and comfort. As I rang the doorbell, I could hear laughter drifting through the air, the way it does when happiness feels alive and almost physical, and when Lily's mother opened the door, I could practically taste freedom on my tongue. However, I quickly learned that she was not expecting me, not tonight. Lily was away with her family, and there was no sleepover. Panic coursed through my veins as I stammered out a clumsy lie, saying my parents were waiting for me at home and I just needed to borrow a book for the night, all while the metallic taste of fear settled on my tongue, horrified at the thought of returning to my empty house, my life crashing down around me. But the worst was yet to come as Mrs. Thompson, the eager mother, insisted I come inside, convinced that waiting for Lily's return soon was the best idea. They had a spacious living room, a warm fireplace, and home-baked cookies that smelled like a warm hug, and it almost convinced me I was safe until she turned to me with a smile that felt too wide, inviting me to stay for the night. I stood rooted to the spot, thoughts racing about how my parents would react if they found out I'd lied, if they came looking for me. But the lure of the cozy living room was almost irresistible, swallowing my fears, so I accepted and still felt a pang of guilt as I watched the last light of day escape, replaced by shadows that loomed ominously in the corners of the room. Mrs. Thompson seemed delighted, her eyes sparkling with energy as she ushered me to the couch, turning on the TV to my favorite show, and for a few moments, I felt a fleeting sense of happiness, but that comfort unraveled quickly. When the doorbell rang again, and my heart sank as I opened the door to see a towering figure standing in the doorway, a man I'd never seen before with an intimidating look that made my stomach twist. He asked for Lily, and the moment I explained she wasn't home, his demeanor shifted to something cold and calculating, and I could sense danger lurking behind his friendly smile, like a predator sizing up its prey. Mrs. Thompson chuckled lightly, waving it off, but my instincts screamed at me that something was wrong, and I watched her invite him in with too much hospitality, my discomfort escalating as tension hung in the air. I was paralyzed as I clutched my backpack tightly, frozen to the spot while the man stepped into the living room, but he didn't sit down. He lingered at the edge of the room, his eyes darting about, and that's when I noticed how the shadows seemed to creep closer, engulfing the light like a thick fog, and with every tick of the clock on the wall, dread tightened around my chest until I could barely breathe. Mrs. Thompson continued chatting with this stranger, oblivious to the way his gaze lingered on me, every heartbeat drumming louder in my ears until suddenly, I heard Lily's name again, and something inside me snapped. Fear surged through me like wildfire, and the bile threatened to rise in my throat as I realized I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave. Still clutching my backpack, I snuck quietly towards the front door, but with every step, I could feel the weight of the man's gaze trailing me, and just as I reached for the doorknob, it twisted open as if he'd anticipated my every move, and I found myself suddenly face to face with the abyss of panic as his smile widened, a Cheshire cat grin that sent shocking waves of terror coursing through me. It was the moment when reality stretched too thin, and I felt like I was on the verge of being swallowed by darkness. Scrambling backward, I bolted from the house, bursting into the night, my heart pounding in my ears as I stumbled down the street with my breath coming out in desperate gasps. I ran blindly, not caring where my little legs took me, fueled by the primal instinct to survive as I cast glances behind me, half expecting the man to chase me like a wolf after a lost lamb, but miraculously, I made it home, breathless and shaking, terrified and exhilarated, thinking I'd escaped him, thinking I was safe. I collapsed in bed that night, my heart still racing, guilt gnawing at me like a relentless animal, wondering if I had betrayed my parents, or worse, unknowingly placed myself in danger. But as I lay there, I imagined how they'd react if they knew I had lied to them. Would they have left me home alone? Would they have realized that my innocent whisper of a lie had led me to the brink of such profound terror? As the darkness wrapped around me, I promised myself I'd never lie again, a naive promise made by a child who didn't understand the dangers lurking in the shadows of deceit. Only years later did I learn that Mrs. Thompson wasn't the angel I thought she was, and that man, the one who had come knocking, was her accomplice, a monster who had haunted that neighborhood, leaving ripples of pain wherever he went. I sometimes still wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, reliving those moments, and every time I do, I'm reminded of the importance of honesty, but even more so of the darkness that lies waiting for a chance to creep in, a darkness I once barely escaped and one that still whispers to me in the darkest corners of my mind, urging me to remember that not every sleepover, not every innocent lie, ends happily ever after. For over 5 years, I meticulously crafted the perfect lie, woven so tightly into the fabric of my daily life that I almost believed it myself, a lie that kept me out of the clutches of shame and the mirror's cold reflection, lying to Ben, the kind old baker down the street, about my eating habits because I feared his judgment. It started innocently when I asked him to cut my favorite pastry into smaller, less guilty slices, claiming I was trying to cut back for health reasons, and to my surprise, he laughed and called me disciplined, encouraging me to treat myself occasionally. Our exchanges became a ritual. I would stroll into his shop every Saturday morning, feigning enthusiasm about my so-called new lifestyle, giving him endless stories of gym sessions and meal preps, each a thread in the fabric of the elaborate facade I had built. The baker would nod, his flour-dusted hands kneading dough as he listened to my tales, his face lined with years of warmth yet shadowed by the sorrow of losing his wife too soon, an author of pastries now living only through his creations and a burden on my conscience. As the years passed, I grew increasingly anxious about my body, terrified of how my size would change the way he treated me, convinced that if he ever discovered the truth, that I actually devoured cakes and cookies each night, hoarding them like contraband in the shadows of my kitchen, he would kick me out of his store, spitting my name like it was the sour taste of burnt dough. My lies spiraled into a twisted dependency. I claimed I was trying to be a role model for my sister, even as I made excuses not to join her for family dinners, all the while savoring sugary confections in private, the shame compounding like layers of fat in a pastry. I convinced myself that I was doing it for him, for our friendship. Ben had become my tether to a nicer version of myself, someone who was allowed to indulge sparingly instead of reveling in gluttony, yet every weekend I felt an icy grip of dread knowing I had to maintain the ruse. It wasn't long before I learned the depths of human ignorance. The day Ben offered me a job as a part-time assistant in his bakery felt like a dream, but it quickly twisted into my worst nightmare. I was terrified of the gauntlet of bakery life and the hot air mixed with sugar and French vanilla engulfing me. Before I knew it, I was knee-deep in flour, surrounded by fluffy pastries and dense cookies, the very sources of my shame and secret. Each day, I watched the sparkle in Ben's eyes return as he revealed passion with each whip of the batter, a stark reminder of how empty my own life had become. My heart raced in panic. I was surrounded by my lie like a spider in a web, knowing my true self was nothing more than a fat shadow lurking behind the thin, happy facade I presented. Yet no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to confess. The words tangled in my throat, fighting against the insecurities built over years of deception. Yet one fateful day, everything changed, starting with the subtlety of strange occurrences, a ripple in the air that whispered of dread, a fading scent of vanilla, and a peculiar chill that swept through the bakery. It began with a lingering shadow that loomed over the pastries, a flicker out of the corner of my eye that left me shaken, but I brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion and the ever-present pressure of the job. Then the bakery started to feel heavier, an oppressive blanket of dread, as customers began to complain of an unusual aftertaste in the treats, a salty tang that snuck its way into frosting and cream, coaxing my mind toward dark rumors of the baker's health deteriorating. Wasn't it ironic how, the longer I lived under the weight of my dishonesty, the more I felt the walls closing in? Then, one stormy night after the store had closed, I heard Ben's labored breaths, heavy and strange, echoing through the kitchen, the sound fleeing into the shadows as I attempted to wipe the counters clean of sugary residue. My heart churned with worry as I stumbled upon him in the back of the kitchen, each breath rippling through the air like a prelude to something terrible. That's when I saw it, the outline behind him, something dark that sagged with an almost human quality, its shape writhing like a stolen spirit, watching me with hollow eyes as Ben spoke softly to it, the words filled with despair. I realized in that moment he was arguing with his late wife, hallucinating her existence in that space he filled with sweet memories and ghostly nostalgia. My stomach twisted with a new fear, not just for my own truth but for his unbroken heart that had inherited the bitterness of loss. In that instant, I knew I had to come clean before it shattered like the fragile glass of the bakery's chandeliers. I blurted out the truth, the words spilling like flour from a clumsy bag, the late-night binges, the guilt, the reasons I kept up the charade, desperately searching for sympathy in his kind eyes that were now glazed with confusion and disappointment. But a deeper, darker shadow lingered behind him, inching closer, tightening the air around me. It seemed I had awoken something, broke the unspoken bond that kept the truth buried between us, and now the lies bore a heavy cost as a low growl echoed through the room, and everything I had fabricated merged with the bitter reality that the spirit of grief was now driving Ben deeper into madness, and I was tethered in a web, fashioned from a flower-sweetened betrayal. The entity, spurred by my revelation, lunged toward me, a wisp of smoke curling against the light, and I was suddenly enveloped in despair. The darkness clotted my insides, filling me with the undeniable weight of sheer horror as I grasped the cruel nature of my deception. The truth bared all, turning the baker's pain into something tangible, and for the first time in years, I understood that the lies were never just mine. They belonged to the sweet memories of a life that once flourished, now warped by whispers and shadows. And then it all surged within me, a suffocating need for redemption, for connection shattered by my own selfishness. I could only hope that in breaking the cycle of deceit, I wasn't too late to save us both from the pastry-fueled nightmare that awaited as the darkness pressed in, tightening its grip like freshly kneaded dough, threatening to swallow not just our lives, but the very essence of the bakery itself. For years, we had an elf on the shelf named Henry, a charming little thing that my parents insisted brought us good behavior points with Santa, but to me, he was nothing more than an omnipresent nightmare, an intrusive sentinel perched on our living room shelf, judging my every move with those beady glass eyes that seemed to glisten in the dark, a piercing gaze that felt like it was dissecting my soul. I remember the countless times I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, feeling compelled to glance at him, convinced he shifted positions or was, God forbid, looking directly at me when I was doing nothing but trying to breathe. But my dread only intensified after that one horrifying night when I came downstairs for a glass of water, my parents asleep, the house eerily quiet, and there he was, Henry, but it seemed like he had moved, slumped a bit, as if gravity had finally drained the spirit from that cursed porcelain body, his cracked smile casting a ghastly pallor in the dim light of the moon filtering through the window, and I shook my head at my own foolish paranoia, dismissing the idea. But when I turned to grab the glass, a faint sound spun me around. A soft whisper of fabric brushing against something hard, and I blinked, my heart in my throat, only to find Henry had, impossibly, changed positions again. This time he was staring right at me with those soulless eyes, and I fled back to my room, convinced I was losing my mind. Weeks turned into months, the holiday season approached, but the joy that usually accompanied the time of year was lost on me. Every time I walked past that shelf and saw Henry's fixed grin, I felt like I was being swallowed whole. And then one December night, as the first snowflakes began to drift softly down from the heavens, I came home from school, exhausted and spent only to find the house flooded with the scent of burnt cookies and pine, my joy fading into dread as I expected another night of sleepless terror fueled by the elf's piercing watch. But somehow, it felt different, softer, and I let my guard down, lured into the warmth of holiday lights twinkling around the living room until I finally plopped on the couch, peering at Henry through half-closed eyes. The flickering light highlighted the cracks and chips that lined his porcelain form, revealing at the same time this disturbing beauty, and that's when it happened. My baby brother, ending his innocent toddler stage of delightful mischief, burst into the room like a whirlwind, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, his wispy blonde hair a tornado atop his head. He dashed toward Henry, eyes wide, and I felt a sudden chill crawl down my spine as he stretched out a tiny, sticky hand and knocked Henry off his perch with a flurry of giggles. And while I expected him to shatter on impact, something dreadful took hold as Henry landed softly on the carpet, his head twisted in a way that should have split him open. But it didn't. Instead, his eyes darkened, and the air thickened as silence enveloped our home. An oppressive feeling, foreboding and malignant, washed over me, spreading like poison while my brother's laughter faded into confusion, and as I looked around for help, I felt an unnatural presence flickering at the back of my mind, the unmistakable sensation that we weren't alone. The lights above flickered, and suddenly, the temperature dropped, my breath misted in front of my face, and deep inside me, the predatory instinct to flee kicked in. But before I could react, spectacle unfolded. Henry unnaturally righted himself, eyes glinting with hunger, and where his smile had once been innocent, a grotesque version crawled back into place, wide and stretched beyond reason, revealing teeth like jagged shards of glass, and as I incapacitated in thick air, I saw flashes of memories, of times I had lied, been selfish, or lashed out, and suddenly I understood he was never there to report to Santa, he was there to siphon my soul, feeding off of my darkest fears, becoming stronger every time I sensed his watchful gaze, and, terrified, I stumbled backward while my brother's laughter turned to wails of terror at the sight of me backpedaling away, as I banged into the wall desperately searching for an escape, only to find Henry had jumped off the shelf and somehow was now standing directly in front of me, blocking the doorway. Just as I felt my sanity unravel, my parents charged into the room, all smiles and warmth, completely oblivious, yelling about how they'd just seen Artie from the bakery had dropped off goodies, and I thought about screaming to warn them, but the energy shifted, an unbearable weight crushing my chest as my younger brother's wails dissolved into a soft chortle, Henry tilting his head almost lovingly at my parents before slipping into my bedroom and disappearing. I stood frozen, horrified and relieved when the door swung back shut, allowing me to breathe just a second longer, but my heart collapsed when I realized my family no longer acknowledged my presence. Days passed in a numbing haze, my brother seemed entranced by Henry, sharing wafting giggles, while I felt like I was fading away beneath a heavy cloak of darkness, and when one evening, I crept into my brother's room, desperate for a shred of normalcy, I found them together on the floor, chatting as if they were lifelong friends. I should have dragged him out of there, slapped some sense into his adorable little face, but I was paralyzed with fear. That's when I heard the whispers merge into laughter, both of them giggling, while Henry's unnatural smile grew wider, each echo seeming to rattle my bones. Finally, that day arrived. The day before Christmas. There was no dash for presents, no excitement, only the growing understanding that something irretrievable had been lost. All the while, Henry's gaze followed me like a predator stalking its prey, each hollow laugh deepening my dread until at last I made the decision. I would end this madness, and as midnight crept closer, I cordoned my thoughts into a single fierce resolve, gathering every ounce of courage as I tiptoed down the hall. I moved past my parents' door, still oblivious, slumbering away blissfully. Somehow, everything felt oddly quiet, like the very air was holding its breath with anticipation, and there, in the living room, beneath the twinkling strands of murderous lights, Henry loomed, waiting, for me to crack, to falter, to once again become his feast. Rage burned in my chest when I snatched Henry from his throne, brandished him above my head, and prepared to crush him against the hardwood floor. The crack of porcelain could end this, but a flood of dark thoughts enveloped me. Instead of laughter and warmth, I sensed shadows swirling around me, flitting in and out of dim corners, and somehow, I began to feel cold and regretful, all the worst parts of myself surfacing, taunting me, and as I stood frozen, I came face to face with my uncertainty, paralyzed until at last realization surged. I wasn't broken, I was angry. With all the strength I could muster, I hurled Henry straight into the fireplace. As he landed among the logs, the energy in the room shifted, the shadows screeched in horror, slithering away beneath the mantel, and then came the searing realization of warmth in my chest as a deafening crackle echoed, the flames consuming Henry's cursed form, peeling away his enchantment like a mask from his face. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, liberated. Moments later, the house swirled with an intoxicating warmth. My brother stirred, snuggled into his blanket, eyes fluttering open, tranquility blossomed across his petite features, and by morning, Henry was nothing but ash, gone forever. And as I looked around the living room, feeling like real light had finally broken through, the joy of Christmas flooded back into my home, only for it to be overshadowed by how little I wanted to feel relief. At last, I was free, and yet an ember of worry sparked. Could those shadows return? Yet here I was, beckoning the dawn, knowing full well I would protect my brother from whatever haunted our world, but also understanding I needed to carry my own darkness forward, a shadow of what had once been. But I would nurse this new flame. For Henry was dead forever, and despite the burden that lay ahead, I welcomed the relief that filled my heart. For the last 10 years, I've built my life on the shaky foundation of my own lies, convinced that gaslighting myself was the only way to survive the sprawling darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. It all began with a fleeting thought on a cold autumn night, the trees swaying like dark sentinels outside my window, whispering secrets of truths I didn't want to hear, and somewhere in that chill, a desire stirred within me to rewrite the narrative of my existence. To take control of my reality by crafting an alternate version of myself, a version that everyone around me would believe, and in return, I crafted self-assurances like a repeated prayer. convincing not just myself but also my friends and family that I was always the life of the party, the optimist who sought silver linings in every struggle. But deep down, I felt like a ghost drifting through a waking nightmare, losing grasp on the boundaries between what was real and what was just a figment of my anxiety, a haze of denial obscuring all. I spun tales of grandeur where I was a successful artist, eluding the truth that I spent my days working in a dull office, covering my fragile self with the vivid pigments of my imagined life, a life where people respected me, loved me, and saw something worthy. The years dissolved into a blur as I meticulously crafted a web of half-truths and delusions, convincing those I cared about, and eventually even myself, that my canvas was full of brilliant strokes, but inside, the colors muddied, pulling me into a relentless cycle of fear and deception. As I smiled through the facade at birthday parties and family gatherings, laughing when I should have been crying, skills I mastered over time, each mask more polished with layers of deceit, while at night, I'd stare at the ceiling, the silence enveloping me like a thick fog as I searched for the truth buried deep beneath my make-believe, whispering to myself how it was too late to turn back, far too late to reveal the cracks in my shimmering disguise. My sister Sarah, bless her heart, always believed my tales. Her bright eyes reflecting the confidence I had instilled in her. She would often talk about my upcoming art show, a grand event I fabricated, and I just kept letting those lies spill from my lips, watching her excitement bloom. But with each passing day, I felt the weight of my lies like boulders resting on my chest, suffocating me. Things spiraled out of control when I fell for someone truly remarkable. Jared, with his golden laughter and boundless talent, a man whose light illuminated the corners of my own darkness. I wanted so desperately to share my life with him, to let him see the real me, but all I managed to do was trap him in my web, feeding him scraps of reality while withholding the bitter truth of my existence. My genuine self was hidden beneath layers of betrayal to my own spirit. Over coffee dates and twilight walks, I showcased elaborately fabricated stories of success, sidestepping the reality of a girl paralyzed by her own fears. Yet the more I cloaked myself in this idealized version, the more I realized I loathed who I had become, a hollow echo in the din of my own creation. It was ultimately our year anniversary that broke me, a beautifully wrapped gift waiting for me at my doorstep with my name scrawled across it in Jared's spindly handwriting. My heart raced as I tore off the paper, revealing a book titled The Art of Being Real, a journal filled with notes, sketches, and reflections, the blank pages blanketing his hopes for our future. It felt like a physical manifestation of everything I couldn't be, and just like that, the gilded facade collapsed in my chest, dust and shadows swirling around me. I thought I could maintain the illusion, that I could gaslight my own heart into believing in me, but the reality was crashing in like an unforgiving tide, every whisper of "you'll never be good enough" crashing against the fortress I built. Panic ripped through me, and I confronted Jared, my breath coming in shallow bursts, begging for a way to escape the spiraling waves of truth. I fought against the revelations that screamed louder than my lies. "I'm not who you think I am," I cried, watching confusion flash in his eyes, the kind eyes that once sparkled with sincerity now clouded over with an unrecognizable mix of concern and disappointment. All peace crumbled as I revealed the hollow manning behind the curtain, cracking under the pressure of fabrications, and the panic over losing him became an all-consuming fire. My mind twisted into a frenzy, sending me deeper into the abyss until that moment came, a glimmer of clarity illuminating an unshakable truth. The people I'd gaslit would always be able to see through my layers of deception eventually, and the only way to save anyone was to finally own my brokenness, to peel off the layers that seemed to protect but actually chained me down. I thought I was protecting everyone else, living my life in a delusional bubble, but I had only imprisoned myself in a world of distortions, and it was then, while drenched in tears and shattered confessions, that I irrevocably changed the story I'd been telling not just Jared but everyone, hoping against hope that they would understand and not view me as just a mindless liar but as a flawed human being striving for authenticity. But as Jared looked away, searching for the right words, I realized that sometimes the truth hurts worse than any lie, and despite pouring my heart out, the space that once vibrated with love felt colder, an echo of all the things I'd concealed crashing around me, and as silence draped around us like a thick fog, I feared that maybe this time, I really had lost it all. The night I decided to tell my Uber driver I was pregnant was one of the coldest in November, the kind of bitter chill that slices through skin and settles in your bones, and I had just left a disastrous party, surrounded by strangers whose laughter felt like needles in my chest. The bright, glaring neon signs of the city blurred past in a haze, and I could feel the weight of my phone against my thigh, the app open, a countdown to an arrival I desperately needed. It was stupid, really. I rarely took Ubers, usually opting for the bus, But that night I wanted to escape the shattering silence of my empty apartment and the nagging voice in my head that reminded me how deeply alone I was. As I entered the car, a heavy-set man with a scraggly beard driving a weathered Hyundai nodded at me in the rearview mirror, and I offered a half-hearted smile, unsure how to fill the awkward silence. I thought about the ways I could initiate some small talk, maybe ask him about his night or comment on the weather, but instead, something snapped within me, fueled by the desperation and urge to be seen. "I'm pregnant, you know," I blurted out, and as the words tumbled from my lips, I marveled at my own audacity. There was a stunned pause before I heard him inhale sharply, and then, to my shock, he responded with genuine concern, eyes darting to the mirror as if to assess my condition. The conversation flowed easily after that, infused with questions about how far along I was and whether or not I was feeling okay. It felt strangely freeing to lie, to pretend for just a moment that I was cradling a life inside me, and the more we talked, the more my heart raced, not with fear, but exhilaration. My Uber rating spiked immediately after, and I found myself caught in a strange loop where my status, my worth, apparently hinged on the validation of strangers in this makeshift world. This fictitious pregnancy morphed into a shield, an anchor that allowed me to navigate through the unpredictable terrain of each car ride and these transient connections. I began sharing the tale, a little more embellishment here, a minor detail there each time, the fibs growing from a simple phase into a fleshed-out story of hope and impending joy. I became someone new in those rides, a mother-to-be navigating the treacherous waters of life in the city, and the drivers, such lonely souls in their own right, became confidants, eager to share advice, their own stories intertwined with mine. One night, a driver named Amir, who talked about his own children, exchanged numbers with me, suggesting I meet him and his family, and despite the unease that flared in my chest when the thought of it crossed my mind, I agreed. He was kind, I reasoned, and maybe that kindness wasn't so hard to accept, after all. After 3 months of this spinning web of lies, I was suddenly tangled in something more than just a harmless ruse. I was developing relationships, gathering friends, people who saw me as someone I wasn't, but desperately wanted to be. However, the truth of it burrowed under my skin, gnawing at me like a persistent itch I could never reach. I had created something fragile and meaningful through fragile, borrowed stories. But then came that one ride, the last endeavor in my facade, when I claimed to be headed to a high-risk ultrasound while trying to gather the courage to finally confess that I had been lying all along, and I was greeted by a woman in the driver's seat. Her name was Lily. We exchanged pleasantries, and something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, caught me off guard. As our conversation flowed, she sounded alarmingly familiar, recounting her own pregnancy, her highs, and fears as a soon-to-be mother, and the weight of her truth connected to mine unraveled tighter. I could feel the knot in my throat tightening, and when I fumbled to keep the lie afloat, the words twisted into painful knots, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, her expression shifted. There was pain there, raw and deep, layered with grief that spoke volumes far exceeding what I could clearly interpret. "You don't have to lie to me, you know. I can tell when someone pretends," she said, her voice low and soft, like rippling water disturbed by a stone, and the impact crushed me in that moment. I felt exposed, stripped bare in a way I hadn't anticipated. She spoke of loss, of hope, each word heavy with unrelenting honesty that bore into my soul, and in that tight silence, the facade shattered beneath the weight of reality, revealing me not as the courageous mother, but as the frightened woman grasping at darkness. My fingers trembled, and I couldn't breathe, realizing I had encapsulated the struggles of so many into my own fragile narrative, and that one lie had led me down this spiraling path of something so much larger than I had ever anticipated. I rushed home, realizing with each mile that truly connecting with people, their grief, hopes, and dreams, had become the balm to my own loneliness, though born through deception. I began deleting my ride history, blocking numbers, curating my reality in bits and pieces, suffering the guilt of keeping everyone in the dark, but in my desperate quest for belonging, I had unwittingly discovered a fragile thread connecting us all within our shared human experiences. I realized it was time to confront the truth I had hidden from myself, that I wasn't unworthy of relationships without the facade, I had simply been afraid. But as the autumn leaves whirled down around me, I felt the shadows stretch long and heavy, whispering doubts about what was real and what had unraveled. The recasting of my identity clung uncomfortably, and I feared it was too late to salvage the remnants left in the wake of my deceit. In my attempts to find connection, I had instead spun a web of isolation, and as I stared at the night sky, their stars glimmering like distant dreams, I clung to one final hope, that perhaps, just perhaps, Somewhere between the truth and the lie, I might finally find myself again. Growing up in a small, predominantly white town, I always felt like an outsider, not because of my race, my dad was white and my mom was Puerto Rican, but because I lacked the adventurous backstory that so many of my classmates boasted about. If your family hails from somewhere exotic, it automatically grants you some status at school, and I craved that validation, so I began to weave elaborate tales of my heritage, claiming to be part mysterious immigrant, part ancient warrior, and the bits I conjured up dazzled my peers, who greeted my colorful stories with admiration and envy. My first tall tale involved claiming I was half Japanese, spinning tales about my supposed samurai ancestors who escaped the feudal wars to find peace and prosperity in America. As my friends eagerly devoured every word, I felt a rush of power, a thrill that overshadowed the gnawing guilt of my deceit. Sinister whispers danced in the back of my mind, warning me that eventually, I would get caught. Yet the deeper I dug into my fabrications, the more it felt like a game, albeit a dangerous one. I was invited to a cultural weekend at school, and panic clotted my gut as I realized I'd need to maintain my lies. That night, I plunged into hours of research, learning about Japanese traditions and even attempting to learn some phrases, dreaming of the moment I could regale everyone with a perfectly articulated story of my ancestry. When the weekend arrived, I showed up in a makeshift kimono I'd crafted from an old bedsheet, feeling like a fraud but riding high on their expectations, until it all spiraled out of control. One of my classmates, a boy named Ethan, had a knack for spotting inconsistencies, and halfway through my elaborate presentation, he asked me about my family's Japanese recipes. Like a deer caught in headlights, I floundered, desperately trying to remember the few dishes I had read about. Embarrassment washed over me, and in a moment of sheer panic, I blurted out, "My grandma's secret recipe for curry." Everyone stood silent for a heartbeat, and then erupted into laughter. Instead of faltering, I leaned into it, assuming a goofy grin that seemed to endear me to them. Little did I know these moments of perceived genius would burrow deeper into my conscience. The facade continued. I claimed experiences I had never lived, friendships I had never forged, and adventures I had never embarked on, until they became part of my being, sinking beneath the skin and dictating a life I hadn't truly lived. As the years trickled by, the details blurred, bleeding into each other, and I felt a yawning chasm of loneliness open up inside of me as the need to exist in this fabricated identity intensified. What should have been the innocent ebb and flow of teenage existence became a minefield of extremes. Then came prom night, a long-awaited event I had eagerly anticipated but now felt bitterly unprepared for. I walked into that gym, convinced everyone could see right through me, that they would unravel the threads of lies woven into my persona. Yet, to my surprise, I was swept into the limelight, voted prom queen on the strength of my popularity, but just as the music swelled and I was lifted into the spotlight, Ethan appeared, standing at the periphery, gauging my every move with a scrutinizing gaze. He didn't take his eyes off me, and there was an unease in his demeanor that felt spine-chilling. The evening unfolded in highlights of laughter and dancing, but Ethan refused to let me forget his presence, a shadow looming over my splendor like a harbinger of doom. The moment came when he cornered me in a quiet back corridor, away from the jubilation, and leaned into me, nostrils flaring as he hissed, "You're a fraud. You've spent every waking moment lying to us, haven't you?" The world spun, the industry of my laughter drowned in his venomous accusation, the pop of the balloon I had inflated in my own mind bursting with such a finality that it knocked the wind out of me. I could see the disdain in his eyes as he drew back his hand as if to strike, but rather than fury, there was pity. The quiet of that hallway was deafening as he left me there, battered and exposed, and every friend I had ever forged an unsound bond with scattered back into the dance, unaware that the girl they adored was merely a reflection of their expectations, a hollow shell. I spent the summer hiding, grappling with the festering abomination of my lies until I decided to come clean back at school. When the new term started, I gathered my courage and faced them, but my confession fell flat. Rather than the validation I anticipated, I was met with cold indifference. They had moved on, their lives untouched by my turmoil, and in that moment, I understood I was eternally shackled to my fabrications, misplaced in an unkind world, condemned to exist as a ghost haunting my own history, too terrified to admit the truth, the simple fact that I would never belong nowhere, not even in my own skin, and in that realization, I finally understood that sometimes, the stories we tell, no matter how beautifully woven, can entrap us in a web of our own making, spiraling us into the darkness, never to escape. The day started like any other, the sun was barely peeking through the clouds, but I had my usual excuse ready, rehearsed to a T: "I'm going to weld in the garage, sweetie." Just need to finish up a project." My daughter, with her unruly curls and bright smile, nodded enthusiastically, wrapped up in the world she created within her room filled with dolls and sketches, blissfully unaware of the real reason I shut the door behind me. You see, I wasn't welding, I was slipping outside to the garage not to work but to indulge in the devil's lettuce, that green escape that beckoned like a siren's call whenever the world became too much. I opened the garage door, the cool breeze catching my breath as I took out the neatly rolled joint from the hidden stash beneath an old toolbox. With a quick flick of my lighter, the flame danced to life, and I took that first puff, feeling the familiar haze wash over me. For a moment, I was free, floating somewhere above the mundane daily grind of life, of parenting, of being everything to my little girl. My mind, usually cluttered with responsibilities and worries, softened, and I let out a sigh of contentment, until I heard it. A soft whimper, a sound so pure that it cut through my tranquility like a knife. My heart dropped. I dropped the joint, scrambling toward the garage door, half expecting to see her standing at the threshold, tears staining her cheeks, but no, she wasn't there. I searched around, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I heard it again, a faint cry, more pronounced this time, originating from the upstairs. Panic gripped me like icy fingers, and I rushed back inside, pushing the door open so fast it clanged against the wall. "Honey. Are you okay?" I called, my voice laced with a mix of fear and guilt. Silence. The air felt thick and oppressive as I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood amplifying the tension. I reached her room, the door slightly ajar, and the sight that greeted me would haunt me for years to come. My daughter was kneeling on the floor, her dolls scattered around her, but it wasn't the mess that caught my attention, it was her face, contorted in a way I had never seen before. Her eyes were wide with terror, staring at something outside her window, something I couldn't see. I rushed inside, gripping her shoulders, trying to shake her from whatever trance had entranced her, but the moment I touched her, she screamed, a blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the house. "Daddy, no. Don't let it in," she cried, her tiny hands flailing as if to ward off an invisible intruder. I turned around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The bright afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating nothing more than the ordinary, yet I could feel an unease creeping down my spine like icy fingers. "Sweetheart, what do you see?" I asked, forcing my voice to be calm, though fear gnawed at me from the inside. "It's right there. You have to make it go away." I looked outside, only to be met with the serene image of our backyard. The trees swayed gently in the wind, the birds flitted about, blissfully unaware of whatever darkness plagued my daughter. "There's nothing there, baby. It's just your imagination," I reassured her, even as self-doubt began to creep in. But the way she shook her head was a dagger to my heart. She was adamant, petrified. "No, Daddy. It's looking at me. Please, please." Forcing her to face me, I held onto her, stifling my mounting dread. "Look at me, honey. It's just your imagination. There's nothing here. Let's play a game, we can color or watch a movie, anything you want," I offered, desperately attempting to steer her attention away. But the sounds from beyond the window were no longer her cries, they began to morph into whispers, strange, sibilant murmurs I couldn't comprehend. I pressed my eyes shut, anger flaring up. Maybe I was just a terrible father who let his daughter down and chose a high over her well-being. I leaned down, hugging her tightly, my heart racing a mile a minute as I whispered words of comfort. Just as I was about to suggest leaving the room, the atmosphere shifted. It felt charged with a sense of urgency, like a storm brewing just beyond our walls. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the window, its hues darkening, shadows stretching unnaturally. It was wrong. All wrong. The safety I had always taken for granted was suddenly in question. "Stay close to me," I said frantically, drawing her in tighter, but she squirmed against me, still fixated on that horrid thing outside. A chill coursed through the air as a dark figure, nothing more than a silhouette, slipped past the window's edge. I couldn't decipher features, but the aura of malevolence enveloped me, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I realized I had completely lost sight of the world I once knew, everything had blurred. My daughter's eyes locked onto something behind me, and before I could react, she screamed again, her voice ringing with pure terror. "Daddy, it's behind you." Spinning around, I barely caught a glimpse of blackness retreating into the shadows of the hallway. My heart thudded in my chest as I grabbed my daughter, racing out of the room, determined to escape the nightmare festering within our home. I flung the door wide, and the staircase loomed ahead of me like a dark abyss. Each step felt heavier, weighed down by something I couldn't name. But the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of desperate voices calling out to me, drawing me in, enticing me to return, to succumb to whatever dark pull pinned me to my daughter's side. "Run," I yelled as we navigated the first few stairs, my mind not processing the chaos erupting around us. The world felt twisted and morphed, every touch of familiar becoming foreign, the shadows casting threatening shapes against the wall. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance, but I refused to let anything take her. I dashed to the door, flinging it open into the warm embrace of the outside world that felt deceptively innocuous. But as I stepped through, the whispers faded, the shadows retreated, and I found myself alone in the yard with my daughter, whose eyes reflected pure uncertainty. I had dragged her out of her nightmares, but at what cost? We stood there, panting under the sun, the weight of silence pressing down. The world around us began to normalize, but the unease lingered, not yet ready to let go. I could feel it watching us, lurking in dimensions I could not perceive. That evening, I made a vow to never abandon my little girl again for fleeting moments of reprieve. I would be the protector she needed. But as the days passed and shadows began to creep back into the corners of my mind, I began to wonder if perhaps those whispers had seduced me long before that day, enticing me to put my daughter at risk by seeking solace in substances meant to help me escape. And as I watched her play, blissfully unaware of the phrase in her father's soul, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread sinking deeper, gnawing at my heart, knowing that there were things far more sinister than any substance, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment I was vulnerable enough to let them in. The night I decided to enter the annual town chili cook-off, I was running on fumes from a week of relentless work and a severe case of procrastination. I hadn't cooked a single thing, and the contest loomed like a dark storm cloud over my head. With locals buzzing about the event, I drove to the only grocery store in town at the last minute, convinced that I could pass off store-bought chili as my own creation. As I scanned the dull metal shelves, my head throbbed with fatigue until my eyes landed on a glistening, red can labeled Grandma Edna's Ultimate Chili. I chuckled as I considered its ironic name. Who would suspect a winner could come from a can? I threw that and a loaf of unimpressive, day-old bread into my basket, hoping to mask the laziness with some semblance of a home-cooked meal. The next morning, under the blurry light of a groggy sunrise, I dressed for the event, feeling more guilty than confident as I recalled the countless hours I spent washing brushes at the art gallery instead of perfecting my chili recipe. When I arrived at the contest, the smell of simmering spices, burnt meat, and charred vegetables assaulted my senses, reminding me of the skills I didn't possess. The air was thick with competition, the other contestants flaunted steaming pots, homemade heirlooms bubbling with pride, while I cringed in apprehension, clutching my can like a shield. My turn arrived, and I plopped the can's contents into a crockpot, deliberately adding the only special ingredient I brought, a sprinkle of overpriced chili powder I bought just as a backup. As I stirred the pot, a curious thing began to happen. The alluring aroma of the chili seemed to shift, almost coming alive as it roiled and bubbled before my eyes. I reached a state of half-hearted anticipation, coaxed by the rising steam that twisted and danced around me, enticing whispers wrapping around my mind like tendrils. I forced myself to shrug it off, focusing instead on the judging panel, who seemed suspiciously indulgent in their duties as they tasted each contestant's batch. When they finally reached my dish, the judges looked at each other with raised eyebrows, the kind that implied they knew something I didn't. Then, to my disbelief, they savored every bite, their expressions shifting from skepticism to pure rapture, their eyes lighting up as they experienced flavors they proclaimed were out of this world. I tried to brush off my growing unease, rationalizing it as mere novelty and sentiment swaying their taste buds, but it began to gnaw at me. How could mere store-bought chili elicit such primal satisfaction? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the contest culminated in a frenzy where everyone anticipated the winner. I was aching to escape the scrutiny, but then my name rang out from the loudspeaker with a triumph that felt like a 10-ton weight on my chest. I'd won. An overwhelming rush of disbelief crashed over me amidst the applause, a sea of smiling faces celebrating my culinary prowess. I accepted the trophy. The glow of victory felt hollow as if the trophy itself had become a curse. The residents cheered, the jubilant sounds faded into an eerie resonance, like a siren call luring me deeper into something I was uneasy about. In the next days, whispers of my win spread through town, but rather than basking in glory, I found myself suffocated by a nagging sensation that grew stronger with each drumming rumor. People began approaching me, asking what my secret was, how could a newcomer triumph over local legends, and my attempts to explain the store-bought chili fell flat. drowned out by a strange adoration they had stirred for me. Paranoia clawed my sanity when I noticed friends growing distant, and old acquaintances developed an unnerving obsession with my victory. Every friendly inquiry began to feel insidious, every smile felt like a trap disguised in innocence. I became convinced that the chili wasn't the benign concoction I'd assumed, it was almost as if Grandma Edna had infused it with something beyond flavor, an emotion that drew people in like moths to a flame. In the weeks that followed, strangers began arriving at my door, murmuring incantations of praise about my legendary chili, demanding my recipe as if it were akin to Holy Scripture. I felt the walls of my home closing in, I started to avoid them, recoiling at the sight of even my closest friends discussing the arts of chili crafting with newfound zeal. Then came the night I awoke at 3 a.m. to the sound of insistent scratching at my door, like 1,000 fingernails tapping furiously, growing louder with every frenzied second. With dread clamping down upon my insides, I cautiously crept toward the window and peered out into the suffocating darkness. What I saw sent chills racing down my spine. There stood a crowd of familiar faces, drawn in by a hunger so palpable I could almost taste it, their wide eyes gleaming in the moonlight, pupils dilated and alive with a manic obsession that twisted their features into grotesque, desperate masks. They were chanting, whispering the same phrase over and over, "Chili. Chili. Chili." My heart thundered, knowing I had to escape before they noticed my presence. As silently as I could manage, I slipped back from the window and made my way to the back door, intending to flee to the safety of the streets. But as I turned the knob, I felt a warm current pulse through the air, and I froze in place, realizing the pressure resonated like the rhythm of a heartbeat. It dawned on me then that I was enveloped in the very fabric of something strange, something far beyond my comprehension. To my horror, understanding seeped into my mind. The chili was alive, a living entity that thrived on the emotions of those who consumed it, evolving into a heart of yearning that drew the hungry to me like bees to honey. My victory wasn't a stroke of luck, it was a vile curse, woven intricately into the very essence of the world I once inhabited. Suddenly, another loud bang erupted from the door, and muffled voices mingled with the rising crescendo of frantic whispers. Caught between fear and despair, I made a pact with the chill rippling through the air, I would never touch chili again. But it would appear that the prize I sought had already claimed me, leaving me forever tethered to a contest that wasn't merely about cooking, but about power that transcended the mundane. As I stood frozen in horror, the door quaked under the weight of their anticipation, and I realized the only way out was to face the truth I had run from. There would always be a price for victory, and for me, it was the realization that triumph comes at the cost of surrendering a part of your soul, a price I was no longer willing to pay. It had been over a year since I first stepped into Dr. Harris's office, a nondescript little place tucked away in a crumbling brick building that smelled faintly of old coffee and faded hope, and though I had started seeing him for depression, I thought we were making real progress, until the day my treatment took an absurd turn that sent me spiraling into a nightmare. It was an unassuming Tuesday afternoon when I entered his office for what I thought was just another appointment, but something felt off. Dr. Harris looked at me as though I were a complete stranger, his eyes narrowing skeptically at the familiar face before him. I cleared my throat, trying to mask my unease as I sensed a clinical detachment in his demeanor, one reserved for patients he'd never seen before, and when I reminded him of my history, a flicker of confusion crossed his brow, hinting that perhaps I was just a blip in his memory, just another patient lost in a sea of faces, emotions, and diagnoses. Then came the moment that shattered whatever trust I had left. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and, with an unsettling calm, offered me a small bag with a white powder inside, a gesture that hung in the air like a bad joke. "This might help," he said, a lopsided grin twisting his lips, and I stared at him, caught between disbelief and shock as I searched his eyes for the slightest hint of humor, only to find a vacant smile staring back at me. "You know, for the pain," he continued, and my heart raced as I tried to process how my psychiatrist, the man I had turned to for help, was not only failing to recognize me but was also suggesting I self-medicate with cocaine, a drug I had only ever read about in sensational headlines. Frantic thoughts hurtled through my mind, wondering if I hadn't just stumbled into a surreal alternate reality, and I began fumbling for my phone, wondering how quickly I could escape this twisted scene. But before I could gather myself, Dr. Harris leaned closer, eyes glimmering with an intensity that sent an icy shiver down my spine. "You want to forget, don't you?" he said, voice low, smooth as silk yet laced with a sinister undertone, and the tainted air in that dim room felt somehow alive, as if it were holding secrets I was never meant to uncover. At that moment, I was no longer just a patient, I was a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator, And the walls that once felt safe now seemed to close in on me, warping the air with an oppressive weight. He continued pushing the bag toward me, his once comforting presence now twisted into something grotesque, and I was overwhelmed with a growing sense of horror as I envisioned the desperate things that could emerge from the shadows of his mind. I stumbled back, shaking my head, desperate to escape the bizarre confrontation, but deep down, a voice whispered that I couldn't leave just yet. Instead, I managed to sputter out a refusal, insisting that I was not looking to forget, but to heal, only to watch as that crooked grin faltered briefly before he recoiled, an eerie smile returning that made my skin crawl. "Healing is overrated," he retorted, the light in his eyes dimming as the clinical facade slipped away, revealing something darker, something feral lurking beneath his polished exterior. I turned to leave, the weight of his stare pressing cruelly against my back, but as my hand gripped the door, I hesitated, my mind racing with the implications of his actions. Did he truly not remember me? Or was this some perverse game meant to test my resolve? My pulse quickened as I considered all the therapies we had tried together, sessions spent bearing my soul, unraveling years of bottled pain and bitterness, and here he was, offering an escape into a world where sanity seemed a mere afterthought. If he didn't recognize me, did that mean I was just another unfinished puzzle he'd cast aside? Half-asleep dreams of self-destruction danced at the edges of my vision, and I found my mind racing, contemplating medicine's darker manifestations, the therapists who had crossed ethical lines, their boundaries forever lost in their pursuit of some twisted truth. I shook my head again, pleading for clarity, but Dr. Harris simply leaned back and waved a dismissive hand, as if to erase my protests without so much as a thought. "You think too much. Sometimes you have to dive in to understand the waters," he mused, and in that moment, a sliver of primal fear opened inside me. This was not the man I once trusted, and I took my chance to bolt from that room, or so I thought. As I reached for the handle, a sudden wave crashed over me, my sanity felt fragile as I crossed into the unknown, and the lingering offer of a hollow escape clung to my thoughts like a phantom. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping as reality collided with surreality, and panic set in. Others wandered through the building, blissfully unaware of the darkness threaded in their own therapy stories. I half convinced myself to call the authorities, raging against what I'd just experienced, but as I reached for my phone, I realized I had left it behind in the grim office, the final tether to my sense of reality now adrift in his haunted space. I took off running down the staircase 2 steps at a time, every footfall a reminder that I had shared my deepest fears with a man who no longer seemed human. Doubts flooded my mind as I questioned my own memories. Did I dream our sessions? Was it all in my head? I burst through the main door and into the gray afternoon, needing the clarity of fresh air against my fevered skin, but as the light stabbed my eyes, I felt as if a darkness had seeped into the world around me. I stumbled through the city, my senses heightened, scanning faces for any sign of familiarity, my heart pervaded by a relentless dread that seemed to echo what Dr. Harris had said. I wanted to forget. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety, the question of whether I should trust the memories, flooding my mind overshadowed by the cacophony of thoughts. As the sun began to set, the once bustling streets felt increasingly deserted. The fear coiled tighter as shadows took on an unnerving form, each misplaced glance and whispered inquiry amplifying the turmoil swirling in my gut. By nightfall, paranoia clawed at me, intertwining with the remnants of hope. I turned to the only option left, the one place where I figured people still believed in the shared connection of healing. I made my way, each footfall echoing with the remnants of that encounter, past the neon signs of bars and restaurants filled with laughter that felt alien to my sinking heart. I finally reached my friend Jenna's apartment, a refuge from my descent into madness, and as I knocked, desperation clawed at my throat. The door creaked open, and I was met with her warm smile, the flickering light behind her casting a gentle glow around her like a guardian angel. As I poured out my harrowing experience, the comfort of her presence began to wash over me, bolstering my resolve. Jenna listened intently, her brows furrowing with concern as my words spilled forth, and she pulled me closer, assuring me I was safe. But as I began to settle, trying to shake the terror of Dr. Harris's dismissal, I suddenly felt the weight of her gaze change, a flicker of recognition passing over her features and then a shadow of uncertainty creeping in. "He didn't offer you anything, did he?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with an edge I savored too late. A sickening realization pulled in my stomach, and I knew then that Dr. Harris wasn't just losing memories, he was losing his grip. As that truth settled deep within me, I could feel the walls of my fragile sanity thin in the wake of what my mind could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare, leaving me suspended in a limbo where fear became my only friend, and the shadows I had once escaped could now hold my darkest truths. I often taste a drop of my urine when I go to the bathroom, and before you cringe or roll your eyes, let me explain what you don't understand about me, about this bizarre compulsion that has haunted me for years. It all started as a strange childhood habit, a silly dare during a dreadfully boring school camping trip where the group decided to test our limits. I was 5 when I drank the water from a creek despite its murky color, given the bravado of a Hidden Valley survivalist scouting for the next great adventure, but something stirred deep inside me after that. When did urine become the subject of curiosity? Each time I pulled myself up to that porcelain throne, the unfathomable urge would resurface, a desire so subtle at first that I'd ignore it until irrationality took over, and my tongue would flick out to taste the drop lingering at the edge of the bowl before I flushed any guilt down with the remnants of the day. It transformed from a childish whim to an obsession, an attempt to decode the secrets of my own body cloaked in the warmth of yellow fluid that somehow felt like it held answers to questions I never asked. It thrummed with a kind of forbidden pleasure, an elaborate game where each taste helped me slip into a private world that I alone understood, until the day my world tilted on its axis. I was 28 when I stumbled across a forum late one night filled with users discussing the mysterious connections between urine and health, an underground community that whispered about ancient remedies and the supposed cleansing properties of one's own waste. The first time I tasted it during those late-night escapades meant nothing significant, it was just another fleeting escape for peace of mind amidst the chaos of adult life. Yet, the more I read, the more addicted I became, embarking on a tailored journey through alternative healing, where each session in the bathroom felt like a ritual infused with purpose. Little did I know, my body was transforming into something darker, a vessel filled with secrets that sought to be revealed and twisted stories whispered by my insatiable mind. It escalated quickly. I began believing I could decipher tastes as I munched on exotic flavors in restaurants, savoring how they intertwined on my tongue, only to revisit them within the confines of my bathroom where I believed answers would emerge amid the relentless swirling waters. My friends noticed the changes in me, they whispered that I was becoming increasingly bizarre, and that concern rippled through our circle, but I shrugged it off. Couldn't they see that I had become enlightened? They weren't on this journey. Hours spent on the forum made me think I had become something extraordinary, someone privy to profound truths, but they didn't understand what it meant to live outside the commonplace. Yet, as the days lengthened into months, I could feel shadows creeping in, a shadow darker than I ever anticipated, unveiling secrets I never wanted to learn. That night, in a moment of domestic bliss, the sun had long set, and I sat alone in my apartment detached from the world, having convinced myself to taste once more. The first taste of the day would open a floodgate of clarity, the rapid drip into the bowl resounded like a countdown. But as I went to claim my ritual prize, an initial drop tantalized before I tasted something different, something bitter, a rancid note infused with dread. Panic surged through me. How could it be? The bitterness bars the sweetness I once enjoyed. My mind flashed with images of toxic substances swirling through a haunted river as if warning me to turn back, but the warped taste tethered me, dragging my tongue like an anchor, and just as quickly as it came, it turned sharp and unraveled whatever sliver of sanity I thought I possessed. The very thought of abandoning the act repulsed me, yet the taste morphed into something else as I found myself sucked deeper into chaos. I felt compelled to dive deeper, nestling the chaos within until my once soothing routine became a tempest of fever dreams, a bewildering array of flavors that slid through my consciousness with every bathroom visit, sweet and sour, acrid and divine, yet this time they entwined with a pungent reality that clawed back every plea for clarity. Gradually, my body felt wrong. I wilted beneath my skin like a wilted flower reaching for a sun that loomed too far away, each flavor slipping through my fingers like a dream on waking. Even my eyes betrayed me as they grew weary, dark circles replacing the glimmer of vibrancy once carried there. I tried to reduce it, I tried to weed it out like a stifling presence, but it consumed me. The whispers from the forum beckoned me back, promising understanding that eluded me. Perhaps there was an explanation for the bitterness, a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. I found solace in consultations with users, gleaning details from their delusions, each interaction weaving webs that tethered me to a truth I thought I sought until the boundaries of reality started to blur and twist. Then, one fateful morning, I awoke in cold sweat, heart pounding, an unusual heaviness resting upon my chest, and there it was, the moment of clarity cut through the shadows like a knife breaking through darkness. Each glass of water consumed before my ritual, how could I have overlooked it? I had been siphoning from open wounds creeping beneath my very skin. The confusion engulfed me as urgency clawed at my throat. It wasn't my urine revealing secrets, it was my body screaming for help amidst an unnerving concoction brewing just beneath the surface. My health deteriorated, spiraling faster as nights morphed into battles against internal demons, gnarled fists of pain racking my body. But I couldn't give up, there must be an answer hidden within. And then I committed an unthinkable act of desperation I had once ridiculed. I fashioned a makeshift container, a vessel desperate to know my hidden truths in a way I never imagined. With trembling fingers clutching toward the sink, I brewed a storm within, and all caution flew away, courage tainted with reckless abandon. I tasted contagion pooling upon my tongue, a vile concoction birthed from my very essence, as chaos invaded the fibers of my confusion. And the whispers, they crescendoed into laughter, manic voices dancing along the walls of my mind, wheedling that I had become a curiosity far less mundane. The ego of taste summoned forth a ghastly notion as darkness consumed me, the urge turned sour, repeating a vicious circle with no way out. It was then that I understood, I didn't just taste it, it tasted me back. I have been wearing duct tape bras instead of real ones all week, and now I find myself unable to take them off, not because I can't remove the sticky mess but because what lies beneath is something I can confront or even comprehend. It all started innocently enough. I was in a bind, preparing for a last-minute charity event and my usual supportive bras were all in the laundry, and in a fit of desperation, I stumbled onto an online DIY tutorial that promised a temporary fix with nothing but duct tape, and the result was surprisingly flattering. At first, I reveled in the feeling of my breasts being snugly lifted, the way they accentuated my figure. I felt empowered as I stepped into the spotlight. Little did I know that the night would be an invitation to a darkness I couldn't escape from. As I mingled with the crowd, I noticed a woman watching me from the corner of the room, tall and shadowy, her eyes glinting with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I tried to shake her off, but it was as if the duct tape had bonded us in some way, a strange connection that wrapped around my veins tighter than anything that could be made of adhesive. She approached me, her voice a soft, eerie whisper that sent shivers through every inch of my body. "You look lovely," she said, and suddenly my confidence faded as her gaze drilled into my chest. I felt exposed, bare beneath the slick gloss of the tape, and when I glanced down, the mirror's reflection warped in a way that made me gasp. The tape had begun to pulsate, ghostly shadows lurking beneath it, moving as if it were alive. Trying to laugh it off, I excused myself to the bathroom, desperate to tear away the tape and banish whatever shadow had wormed its way into my mind. But as I peeled back the edges, an icy pain wound itself around my ribs, pulling at my skin, and a voice, deep and haunting, echoed through my mind, "You can't take us off, we need you." My heart raced, and fear gripped my throat as I caught glimpses of those shadows beneath the tape, writhing like snakes eager to break free. I stumbled back into the main hall, breathless and wide-eyed, but the woman stood there, a grin plastered on her face as if she knew all along. Over the next few days, as I continued to wear the tape, it became a sinister thing, a physical manifestation of something far darker. I started to hear whispers at night and saw shadows flit across my vision. Each time I caught sight of my reflection, it seemed to cry for help, the tape expanding and contracting as if it were breathing on its own, sucking the very essence out of me. I tried to explain to my friends, but they merely shrugged it off as a prank I was pulling on myself, and even my boyfriend was starting to look at me differently, his eyes filled with concern tinged with disbelief as he'd catch me peeling the edges of my DIY contraption at odd moments. "You need to stop these stupid games," he'd say, but the shadows whispered that he was in on it too, that everyone was part of the grand illusion, just waiting for me to succumb to the trap I had stumbled into. As the week dragged on, I began to lose grip on reality. I stopped going out, letting the tape entrap me in my own home as if it were a protective cocoon, all the while feeling it drain me, holding me hostage to some unseen force. One night, exhaustion washed over me, and I fell asleep drifting in and out of fevered dreams. Each time I woke up, the tape felt tighter, pulling me closer to whatever lay beneath. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the whispers crescendo into a wild shriek, an unholy cacophony echoing off the walls. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding against my ribcage, and in that instant, I caught a glimpse of the woman from the event standing at the foot of my bed, the shadows weaving through her hair and piercing through her hollow eyes with malice. "You can't leave," she chanted over and over, and I could swear I felt the fingers of malevolence reaching for my mind as I struggled against the bindings of that cursed duct tape. I lunged for the lamp, my only weapon, but it flickered to life in an unusual burst, illuminating not the room but a landscape of the shadowy people, the ones trapped within the tape. They reached out, pleading, their mouths moving as silent screams echoed through the air, the woman beginning to laugh, a sound that vibrated through my bones. I turned to flee but found myself paralyzed, the tape seeping into my skin like a parasite. "You'll join us, you already did," she breathed, her grin widening as she stepped closer, shadows whispering promises and threats wrapped in one. I felt the world around me fade, a black void swallowing my being as the shadows began to weave their way through my soul, merging with every thread of my existence. I don't know how long it has been, but now I type these words, trapped in this narrative, wearing duct tape around my chest as if it were my very skin, unable to escape, and I can feel them gaining strength, the whispers growing louder, asking for new blood, new souls. So here I am, urging you not to make the same mistakes I did. Don't be seduced by the tape, or you'll find yourself bound and shrouded in darkness, destined to become one of the echoes beneath it, the shadows that wait to pull another unsuspecting soul into their wretched embrace. I didn't give him the job because his kid is a jerk, and I hate myself for it now. It started out as a standard hiring process for a position at the small tech company I managed. We had several applicants, but Jay Davis caught my attention. His resume was impressive, a testament to his skills and experience, but it was his glowing recommendations that really swayed me. People praised his professionalism, his insight, his ability to work miracles with code. I wanted nothing more than to welcome him aboard, but then I met his son, Timmy. I can still vividly remember the day Jay brought him along to the interview. My office door was ajar when I saw Timmy standing outside, a scruffy kid no older than 10 with an unkempt mop of hair that seemed to bounce as he paced in front of my office. He was clutching a toy robot, jaw set in defiance, clearly bored and uninterested. When Jay asked Timmy to sit quietly, the boy rolled his eyes and plopped down in the corner, ignoring his father completely. Jay started talking about his background, and as he did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Timmy was staring daggers at me. I tried not to focus on him but caught him muttering under his breath, something about how he hoped I wouldn't take his dad's job away from him like some kind of ominous threat. All throughout the interview, I felt like I was being observed, scrutinized by someone far too young to understand the complexities of adult life. When Jay excused himself to take a phone call, I couldn't help but look over at Timmy, whose face twisted in a pout as he cradled the robot, his expression darkening whenever a smile flickered across my face. Just then, my assistant walked by and casually mentioned that Timmy had been bothering the other employees in the waiting area, demanding they play with him or calling them losers for being too adult. I felt a terrible conflict churning in my stomach. Jay was perfect for the role, though that boy was an absolute nightmare, and I was torn between professionalism and the worry of what would happen if I brought on an employee with such an obnoxious child. I didn't have time for disrupted sessions or thrown tantrums. The company was already on shaky ground, and I was the one responsible for keeping it afloat. So as Jay returned to my office, I maneuvered for an excuse and let my hesitation spill out in a vague discomfort, the emotional turmoil roiling within me as I fabricated a lie about needing someone with more experience. Jay's face fell. He looked crestfallen, and for a fleeting moment, I wished I could take it all back, but Timmy was watching me with an unsettling grin, as if he knew I had made the right choice, as if there was no chance in hell I'd be getting rid of him anytime soon. I forced myself to shake off the guilt and reminded myself that I had made the best decision for the company, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that justice was waiting just outside my office door. Reservations mingled with curiosity as days turned into weeks following that interview. I watched the other potential hires flourish or flounder, and every time Jay's name popped up on my screen, his applications to other companies, his social media updates showcasing just how incredible he was, I bit my lip, torn between relief and creepy fascination. But the more I read, the more I felt something was off about Timmy. Posts about them together, Jay and that brat, showed Timmy looking more sinister than before. Even his questions seemed designed to push buttons, as if he reveled in torturing adults. I tried not to think too much of it, until one fateful evening when I received a notification that sent ice prickling down my spine. Jay posted a video to his feed titled "What My Son Can Do." I watched it with bated breath, my heart racing, the warm glow of my screen illuminating my face as I saw Timmy. Only, he was different, older, wearing a hoodie, and surrounded by other kids who looked just like him, eyes dark and expressive, as they chanted hypnotically. The camera zoomed in on Timmy, excitement glistening in his eyes as he held the same robot from before, but it blinked ominously, mechanical limbs twisting in an unnatural dance. I couldn't tear my eyes away in horror. Each flash of their smug, taunting smiles felt like daggers piercing my gut. The chant echoed through my ears, and the connection struck me like lightning. It can find you. It can always find you. I didn't want to believe it, but I remembered the way Timmy stared at me in that office, the crushing weight of his gaze. I thought it was merely a child's interest, but I realized it was so much more, a predator's gaze. That night, sleep eluded me as I wrestled with my thoughts. What kind of kid mates with robots? What kind of father encourages that? All I could think of was how I had wanted to protect my company, my employees, and, most importantly, myself from that smug little devil. The chance that I could have hit Jay, a talented employee, and been rid of that wretched kid gnawed at the edges of my mind like a relentless itch. Days later, I stumbled across a chilling thread buried in a forum. Some people were talking about mysterious disappearances linked to robotic toys, and it all seemed like coincidental chatter until I read the last post. They know where you are. They always know. It was signed simply as a parent. And, suddenly, all the puzzle pieces clicked. Jay had been the common factor in all these incidents. I recalled that night, shadows creeping along my walls, hearing strange whirring outside my window, and then silence fell over my home like a thick blanket. I stepped outside, heart racing, locking eyes with the hulking silhouette of a robot shaped like Timmy's toy in the distance. My breaths grew shallow. I read the words of the parent over and over again until their essence sank into my soul. That's when I made the decision to confront Jay, to warn him about the dark world his son was threading them into. But when I finally called him, his voice was hollow, coated with an unsettling calm, almost as if there was a barrier between us, a stretch of dread woven into every syllable. "Timmy has a gift," he said, his tone eerily cheerful. "You should be proud of him. He's smarter than any of us." I hung up, fingers trembling in disbelief, some part of me knowing that I had just brushed my fingers against something incredibly sinister. Days turned into a long spiral of paranoia. I searched for every connection I could within that forum and watched Timmy's posts evolve into grotesque spectacles. The videos morphed into something else altogether, a twisted extravaganza with Timmy at the center, surrounded by wheeled creations. I was ensnared, bewitched, doubting myself, wondering if I had done the right thing by denying Jay the position. One afternoon, my assistant rushed in, eyes wide and distraught. "Have you seen the news?" I had barely sat down when the report blared through the air, headlines about kids across the city going missing, linked to a mysterious boy who congregated others in their homes, dressed in hoodies like ghouls addressing the lost in a diluted ceremony. My heart raced as she looked at me, asking if I knew anything about Timmy. I felt the weight of my decision crash down like a tidal wave, and that night, I laid blankets across my windowsills as I heard the distant whirring, that unmistakable sound that reminded me of childhood nightmares. I watched the street under a cautious gaze, terrified of that twisted robot apparition, hoping I had done enough to protect my family from whatever had emerged. But then, caught within my paranoia, I felt my phone buzz, and a new notification glimmered in the dark, a message from Jay that read, "Timmy wants to meet you." I wanted to laugh, to scream, but instead, I felt impotent. In the pool of fluorescent light, I clasped the sheets around me, heart pounding so viciously that I could hardly breathe, worried that in saying no to a father's ambition I had awakened something insatiable, an evil creature born in the guise of a child everyone ignored, leading into the night with a lost grin and the glint of metal. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the last thing I remember before the dream took me was the primal instinct of terror wrapping around my throat, echoing a warning deep inside, "It can always find you." Just before I woke, shivering, as the sound of soft giggles danced through my open window, whispering the name of my darkest fears, the name of a boy whose father I had wronged, who, unbeknownst to me, was living a nightmare far darker than any choice I had made. I am that awful ex who everyone dreads, the kind of guy who leaves scorched earth in his wake, heartache trailing like a shadow, but I swear it wasn't always like this. I don't remember falling into the void, yet here I am, a cautionary tale for anyone who dares to fall in love with a monster disguised as a man. It started innocently enough, high school sweethearts with Sarah, perfectly imperfect, laughter shared over slushies in the summer sun, promising forever while the stars bore witness. But a crack formed when I first laid eyes on Amanda at that dreadful party. It wasn't my fault, really. She was just so much more alive than Sarah, filled with this infectious energy that spiraled around us, pulling me in like a moth to flame, and before I knew it, I was wrapped in a web of deceit, whispering sweet nothings to Amanda while maintaining the guise of loyal boyfriend to Sarah. I justified it. After all, Sarah had her charm, but Amanda made my heart race, like the adrenaline rush of a roller coaster. Each kiss an exhilarating free fall. But the bliss was short-lived because I was an idiot, too enamored with myself and my double life, and it all came crashing down like a house of cards when Sarah found out, her eyes wide with betrayal, tears staining her cheeks, and I could almost hear my heart splintering, the sound echoing in the hollow silence I left behind. I tried to make it right, desperate to stitch together the frayed edges of a love I had discarded so carelessly, but Sarah wouldn't take me back, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I was a monster. The world turned gray, and I retreated into my misery, convinced that love was an illusion destined to betray me, and I clung to Amanda, who was only too happy to embrace my shattered soul. We were a disaster, feeding off one another's chaos until the inevitable happened. She found someone, the knife twisting in my gut as I watched her laugh with him, the sparkle in her eyes that once belonged to me now shining so brightly for another. That's when the darkness seeped in, bringing shadows that whispered lies to me every night, drowning me in thoughts that unraveled the frayed threads of my sanity. This is when I became the very person I had dreaded. I plotted and schemed, convinced that my love was a commodity I could win back, a twisted game of emotional chess where I would emerge victorious. I started showing up where I knew Amanda would be, slipping into her life like a ghost, haunting her at coffee shops and crowded bars, never missing a chance to remind her of our past, dredging up memories like a fisherman pulling up wreckage from the river. At first, she seemed flattered, but as my obsession grew, her smiles faltered, replaced by awkward glances and whispered conversations with friends who wore the same worried expressions. Sensing I was losing her, a pitiful rage ignited within, pushing me to the darkest corners of my mind, where sanity fought for space against my reckless need to possess her once more. I crafted elaborate schemes, sending her flowers with taunting notes that hinted at what we had shared, crafting social media posts designed to make her second-guess her choices until it all spiraled out of control. And one night, the small voice of rationality was overrun by desperation when I smashed the glass of a bar to anonymous cheers, shouting Amanda's name as if conjuring demons. Little did I know, I summoned my own. The aftermath was like waking from a nightmare, bloodied knuckles and a pile of regrets at my feet, yet she still wasn't mine. The further I fell into this abyss, the more insane I became, each obsession wrapped tighter around my mind, warping it until I lost track of time and reality. And then came the messages that told me I had crossed a line, foreboding reminders from her friends who threatened police intervention if I didn't back off. But I laughed like a madman, believing that love was worth any price. I thought I could turn the tides, but instead, I only pushed her further away until, one stormy night, I found myself standing outside her new apartment, heart racing and drenched in rain, imagining a world where I could convince her to want me again, pounding on her door like desperation itself until it swung open, and I saw the horror on her face as she took in the sight of me. That's when I truly broke. I let loose the dark thoughts that had been creeping, whispering in shadows. I promised her I would ruin anyone in my way and laughed madly, but the look on her face shifted from fear to pity, and that's when I felt it, like a shadow creeping up my spine. Something in the depths of me snapped, and I dragged my trembling fingers through my hair, realizing I was no longer the charming idiot she had fallen for but a wounded beast. Nobody dreads someone like that. My heart raced as I choked out apologies, begging her to see what we had shared, to acknowledge the remnants of love still tangled in the roots of our past. But she called me sick, wrapped in the surety of her discomfort, and I could feel everything recoiling in my gut. Without realizing it, I was losing my grip again, spiraling down into an even darker pit. I felt my world squeezing tight, the place that once felt secure tearing apart at the seams, and in that moment, enveloped by her quiet dismissal, I recognized a familiar shadow creeping in. I heard a voice, flat and void of emotion, whispering sharp and cold like a blade pressed to the throat. "What do you have left to you?" I couldn't breathe, I felt consumed, and as I stumbled back, the world around me blurred until Amanda slammed the door in my face, shattering the last fragments of my sanity. Outside her apartment, I cried into the rain, but no tears came. Instead, I was left with that hollow ache, an echoing emptiness found only in empty bottles and late-night rantings, wondering how I would ever escape this hell I had made for myself, a twisted ex that everyone would dread. And somewhere, deep down, beyond the wreckage, I realized the darkness wasn't just a cloak I wore, it had become me, and I was now forever bound to it, a prisoner of my own creation, a hurt that can't heal, a curse cast and returned. That's the awful truth, you see. I am that awful ex who everyone dreads, forever haunted by the choices I made, living in the dread of knowing that even love can turn into a haunting nightmare.